Okay. Do you want to pull up the agenda? Oh, perfect. Just had a delay. All right. Welcome to our June Coastal Steelhead Advisory Group meeting. Thank you for joining us. We actually have a 3-hour meeting. We've extended the time for these meetings by an hour today, so that should allow us to get through a number of different topics. I know a lot of these are important to you all, so we'll make sure to allow time for discussion. The meeting purpose is to discuss monitoring and evaluation and input that's been received to date on those sections of the plan, and to discuss a few topics that came out of the review as needing further discussion during this meeting. The second one is to discuss further fisheries regulations impacts. This was something we talked about at our last meeting. We're going to continue that discussion with the advisory group members. There's a homework assignment that we'll report out on related to fisheries regulations. And again, discuss a few topics of interest that were submitted via email or through your comments on those sections that were provided to Toby and summarized in the SharePoint folder. The last thing is to talk about hatchery operations, and we have Anja. Did I say your name right, Anja? And we'll.
It's Anya.
Anya, thank you. Anya will. That makes more sense. That's how you'd say it. We'll have you give a brief presentation related to hatchery programs, and then again discuss a few particular topics related to hatcheries that you all have provided to us. So welcome, Anya, and we'll let you talk a little bit more about yourself during introductions. That's it for our agenda. Are there any proposed changes to this before we talk a little bit about action items? Okay, and remember, if you have a question or comment, you can raise your hand. If you hover over the bottom of your screen, there'll be a little icon to raise your hand. You can also just speak up or use the comment box too. So to provide an overview of the action items from our April 28th meeting, there was a summary sent out to you all. And I don't believe we received any comments on that, but you're welcome to provide comments on the summaries from our meetings. You all provided comments on the draft monitoring and evaluation and fishing regulation sections. All of your comments were compiled on the SharePoint site in the comments folder, and the comments you were also sent directly to Toby, and she also turned around and provided you a track change version of the sections of the proviso that you've reviewed. She provided out those sections with the changes that were made based on your comments. So those 2 items are complete. Thank you for your work on getting Toby comments, and to Toby for turning that around into the track change version of those proviso sections. The other action item was homework. So you were all asked to choose a coastal river and consider how the fisheries regulations might impact that river, both in terms of biology and socioeconomics. Are there alternative methods the department should consider when determining fisheries regulations? Come to the next meeting prepared to discuss. So we have a section of our agenda for you all to report out on that homework assignment. And I already talked about the last action item. Any comments or questions related to our action items? And Luke, thank you for noting spending 3 hours instead of 2. 2 has been rushed, so I also appreciate the extra time as your facilitator to allow you to have some back and forth today. Even though that takes us well into the night. Thank you all for being here. With that, I think we'll switch back over to introductions. And Olivia, do you want to just run through the advisory group list and note who's here? So when Olivia calls on you, also check your audio, just introduce yourself for the members of the public listening in.
Great, thanks, Greer. Can everybody hear me okay? My audio is good. Awesome. So we'll just go down the list here. I don't know if we want to start with WDFW staff, but why don't we go ahead and do that? I am supporting Greer, who just introduced herself. And then next we have Amy Edwards.
Hi, I'm a stock assessment biologist for Region 6, working for Department of Fish and Wildlife.
Thanks, Amy. And then Anya Huff, who I think we heard from already, but
Yeah.
go down.
Hi, Anya Huff. I work in the Hatchery Evaluations and Assessment team, and am, just trying to keep eyeballs on the hatcheries.
Thanks, Anya. And then Erin Couch.
Hi, everyone. Erin Couch. I'm a communications manager in public affairs at Fish and Wildlife.
Thanks, Erin. And then James.
Hi guys, Fish and Wildlife, Region 6 Fish Program Manager. It's really great to see everybody. Thanks.
And Toby.
Hello, I'm a research scientist for Region 6 of Washington Fish and Wildlife.
Thanks, Toby. Now we'll move on to the advisory group members, starting with Bob Kratzer.
Hey, Bob Kratzer, Anglers Guide Service.
Thanks, Bob. And then Caleb Hitzfield, who I don't see here yet.
I don't either.
And then Chris Ringley let us know he's going to be a little late tonight due to a flight delay. And then next we have Jeff Mcmichael.
Hi, I'm Jeff.
Thanks, Jeff. Next we have Jason Roll.
Hi, I'm Jason. Is that all? Just saying my name.
Sure, thanks. Next we have Jessica Helsley. Thought I saw Jessica on here. Maybe she stepped away for a sec. Next, Jonathan Stone.
Hey everyone, Jonathan Stone from Chum Limited.
Thanks, Jonathan. Lee Geist. Not sure if I saw Lee in here yet.
Not yet.
And then Luke Probasco.
Hi, I'm Luke, coming at you live from the Willapa Bay.
Thanks, Luke. And then Mara Zimmerman.
Good evening, Mara Zimmerman, Co-Salmon Partnership.
Thanks, Mara. And Rich Sims.
Hi, Rich Sims here with the Wild Steelhead Coalition and Steelhead Enthusiast.
Thanks, Rich. And last but not least, Roy Morris. Oh, looks like you're still on mute. Try to unmute Roy.
Hitting the one on the screen there. Thank you. Yeah, Roy Morris from CQ. And I retired from Western Washington University's Office of Field Studies, was where I ended my professional career. Actually, I ended as a guide here on the peninsula too. I guided on the peninsula for over 35 years. And as Rich, and am a fishing enthusiast.
Thanks so much, Roy.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Olivia, for helping us get through it. And Luke, I'm sorry, I glanced at your comment, but you're saying 3 hours is rough. So recognizing that, we will take a break partway through. Let's see how today goes. I think we all recognize that we wanted more time for discussion. So we'll see how this goes.
Yeah, I would be totally happy if we did more time in more sessions.
Agreed. Yeah, it's a balance. So let's see how this goes and see if we get everyone's discussion questions addressed and if this feels like the right amount of time after today. So with that, if you want to jump back to the agenda, Olivia, I think that covers our introductory topics from the facilitator point of view, except I just want to mention one thing. Process check-in. This will be between James and I. I just want to give everyone a quick update. I want to remind you all to keep your tone constructive in your feedback to the entire group. This is a group process, and this is just something the facilitator does about midway through, is just remind everyone that we're all working together towards common interests and goals, and we're all doing the best we can. And I really want to recognize all the feedback that we've received. both Triangle and DFW about the process. And as you can see, we've really strived to make changes in our process to reflect what you want to see and what your needs are in terms of being able to provide constructive input to the department and development of this plan. So if anything isn't working, we continue to welcome your feedback. And we love hearing from you, and hopefully the changes we've made in terms of getting materials on the SharePoint for you, making sure that the agenda reflects the topics that you're really interested in discussing, really refining this process of providing comments via track changes and comments directly to Toby in the documents, but also having this time during the meetings to have discussion amongst yourself, as well as hearing from public during the public comment period. So just a quick process check-in, and I think James or Toby or Aaron, did you have any other process check-ins with the group? And then I'll turn it around and ask the advisory group if you wanted to use this time to provide any additional feedback.
Nothing here. Thanks, Greer.
I don't have anything.
Okay. Any advisory group want to have any questions or comments related to process for this advisory group? At this point, anyone have any remaining challenges? Hopefully we've worked through a lot of the SharePoint issues and revisions to their agenda process, as well as our commenting process. Okay, so again, we'll see how this goes today. You know, in terms of the ability to influence the agenda and provide your topics of interest, this seemed to work well. But again, if you have any suggested feedback on how to improve the agenda development process, let us know. Or if you have any challenges or feedback on the review part of this process, also let Toby and I know, and we can try to help resolve those issues. But hearing no need for further conversation, I think we can turn it back to you, James, to just give a brief update related to the budget. And I think this was a requested update from an advisory group member.
Great. Thanks, Greer. Yeah, so we threw this on the agenda here because we had, an interest in this topic, but also over the last few months, I've had some private conversations with advisors here. I think there was an email thread about the budget associated with the Coastal Steelhead Proviso implementation plan. So we felt like we should probably just mention it here briefly so that folks know the direction we're all headed. And I say we, like us here in this room. In about a year, the state's going to have a new operating budget, right? So this is the next biennium starts. That's about a year from today, July 1. And then in September of this year, so that's just coming down here a few months, the governor's going to want to have that budget in front of them. So the governor's office, so they can review packages coming out of Fish and Wildlife. So that's September. So what that means this, at this time of the year before the biennium, internally Fish Program starts developing proposals, things that we want to get funded. So this can be new work, this can be new operating budget requests that are moving forward. So we have some internal deadlines. We started talking about things we needed in the Fish Program, steelhead related, but also much broader than that. At that time, Toby, Aaron, Amy, and I were hanging out in this room with all of you all. Wanted to make sure we didn't miss an opportunity to include this coastal steelhead work that we're talking about here into the budget. This is going to be one of the biggest asks in Region 6, right, in the new biennium. So there's kind of a lot to unpack there, but we just knew we wanted to get it internally on the board as a budget request. Whether that moves forward in WDFW's prioritization process, right? If we move it to the governor's office in September, it's still unknown, but we knew we wanted a general outline, kind of a template of what we hope to see move forward to the governor's office. So that's kind of like the short-term work that we've been doing internally. The good news for this group to think about, because we haven't had time to talk about the budget here broadly, but after the governor's office has reviewed budgets and moves things forward to the legislature, that's like, and I'm not an expert on this, but we can put people in touch that are, that's like a January thing. So if folks are thinking about this timeline, we're talking about completing this work here in December, hopefully before then, right? So we can get all this work through the commission and out for public comment. So we're talking about November, we should have a pretty good idea of what type of money is going to be needed to implement all this work we do here. So the good news is we have a lot of time to keep talking about this. Myself and my position, I didn't have a bunch of time. We needed to get this in front of the fish program like as soon as possible. And we did that. So before maybe I follow up with a couple questions that people might have, I just want to highlight the current kind of package that Toby and I and others in the agency have worked on that describes our work here is pretty broad. But it does describe some really specific things that I know we're going to need. So this is the things all of us have talked about: sport fish monitoring, spawning ground survey work, really expanded coverage there. There's been a lot of interest in sonar. Just the concept has been talked a lot about, but we've, internally with Science Division, really focused in and tried to refine what does that mean? Where do we think we might need sonar? So we've got an area in this rough template for that. And then another piece, just so folks know, because we don't talk about it much, is we have, genetic and aging labs. So these analyze scales and fin clips and things like that. So that work's going to expand. We get more sampling. We get new equipment in the water, new tagging efforts, sonar. We end up with a lot more samples that need to be run. So we've got kind of a placeholder there for money associated with just our normal work that gets expanded. And then probably the last thing we're thinking about is implementing. We need staff to help us pull this off. We're going to have like something on paper that we want to do, but there's, a lot of staff time associated. So kind of to wrap all that up, there's been some internal work to describe what we think we're going to need, but it's pretty broad, and that's going to get refined here in this room, not today, but down the road, well before January when the legislature looks at that. So kind of unpacking a lot in like a 2-minute line item in the agenda, but I want to make sure all the conversations I'd had internally had kind of reached this group. So hopefully that's helpful.
Thanks, James. And Roy has his hand up. Go ahead, Roy.
Getting better at unmuting there. Thank you, James, for that recap on the budget. I talked to Mike Chapman the other day, and I'll be talking to Theringer and Bandaway on some other budget items for the Olympic Peninsula. And one of them in particular relates to where you said the aging and the scale labs and expanding that work. Some of that work is building infrastructure and facilities here on the West End with the Olympic Natural Resource Center as a job starter for natural resource job development. So a lot of the work we're doing here with this Steelhead planning is also going to interface with some of the natural resource jobs training through Huxley College and Peninsula College Forks Branch and other income employment initiatives we have here on the West End, even right to mitigating some of the impacts on guide revenues and such. So thank you.
Thanks for that.
The budget is, we work with the budget with the parks and with Fish and Wildlife too. So thank you.
Great. Thanks, Roy.
Any other comments or questions for James related to budget?
Yeah, and I'll just say folks can reach out if they've got specific things that come up after this. Feel free to just reach out directly, or, folks have been getting good with the email chains, but quick questions on the top of your head, just give me a call and I can share with you what I know. So thanks.
Thank you, James. Okay, that concludes our sort of update introductory part to our meeting. We're going to jump now to the different sections of the plan, starting with monitoring and evaluation. So as a reminder, Toby and DFW staff drafted a section on monitoring and evaluation. It was sent out for review, and a number of you submitted comments, which were housed on the SharePoint site for y'all to look at. And we just brought forward a few topics that seem to generate a lot of discussion or different comments within the comments received. And so there were two in particular. And Toby, I'm just going to hand it to you to give any introductory comments. And then I'm going to bring up a live document for all of these topics of discussion, and it may be a way that I can kind of capture the different perspectives and any discussion that happens around any of the topics, just so we have something to look at, and just a way to capture your feedback. Go ahead, Jonathan.
Yeah, so I was hoping as we're going through this with each section, we could kind of restate the objectives, specifically what the staff is looking for from us. I know it says like inform and advise, but I guess it would help to be a little more specific so we can, make sure that we're providing you with what you need. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
How does that sound, Toby? Do you have any, or James or Aaron, did you have any specific feedback on these two that you're interested in hearing from the advisory group?
Hey, yeah, so we will talk about that kind of as we go through the subjects. Yeah, I think it kind of depends on which particular subject we're talking about, but we have those all queued up in the PowerPoint, so we can talk about it as we get to each one, if that works.
That sound good, Jonathan? And if we don't answer that question, just ask it specifically when we get to that topic. So if you don't hear that in the lead up to the discussion, let us know and we can circle back to it. So Toby, it sounds like you have some slides. You can go ahead and pull them up if you're ready, unless there's other questions from the advisory group. Okay.
Okay. Make sure I'm. Okay, can everyone see the PowerPoint screen?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. All right. All right, well, nice to see all of you again here. I know it's been a couple of months, so we've had some opportunities to review documents and think about the topics that we're going to be covering today. So nice to have everyone in the same room again. So today, as we get into the meat of the advisory group meeting, there's going to be a team of us who will be speaking and sharing about our work and asking for feedback. So myself and then Amy Edwards, our stock assessment biologist from Region 6, is going to be talking a little bit about the test fisheries subject. James is going to be commenting and providing feedback on all the subjects that we cover today. And then we also have Anya Huff here today, who introduced herself, is going to be talking about the hatchery piece. And it's really awesome to have Anya with us today because she's been doing a lot of really hard work evaluating hatcheries, and I won't get too into that right now. I'll let her talk about her own work, but we're very lucky to have Anya on the call today. So I wanted to start out by just kind of taking a step back and looking at where we've been and where we're going on the trajectory of the progress we're trying to make it as a group here. So this is a slide that was included in the first ever advisory group PowerPoint. And it shows the 5 subject areas that we're hoping to cover in this proviso implementation plan. So the 3 in the center here, monitoring and evaluation, fisheries regulations, and hatchery operations. Those are the 3 that are part of this adaptive management strategy and kind of the focus of our work. And then we have 2 other subjects that we want to provide guidance and information around within our work. And those subjects are habitat and socioeconomics. So last time we talked about monitoring evaluation, and I received your comments back on the writing for monitoring evaluation. So thank you for all the feedback you provided there. I hope you had an opportunity to read through the draft that I sent back a couple of weeks ago. A lot of changes were made. It's been 2 months, so there were a lot of significant changes. But I tried to, in the track changes, just show some of the changes that were made based on advisory group feedback. But it was hard to parse out exactly which things came from advisory group and which things were just other changes. But hope you had a chance to read through that. And if you didn't, no worries. You can take a look at it after the meeting. And last time we also started talking about fisheries regulations, but this is a really important part of the Coastal Steelhead Proviso Implementation Plan, maybe the most important part of it. And so I wanted us to have an opportunity to have more in-depth discussion around fisheries regulations today. And then we'll also talk about hatchery operations with Anya at the end of the meeting. And I wanted to take a look at our timeline. Basically, we're on track. This is the timeline we shared in the first meeting. In the winter, we are hoping to complete the management framework. In the spring and summer, we wanted to start applying that framework to individual systems. Today, we're going to start talking about regulations in individual systems, and part of the preparation for this meeting was to think about one particular system that you wanted to provide feedback on. So we'll be taking notes on that feedback that you provide, and that will help us to draft some of the fisheries regulations section in the Coastal Steelhead Proviso Implementation Plan. So looking forward to hearing your feedback on those individual systems. And then in the fall, we'll submit the document to the public and to the commission for review and submit it to the legislature on December 1st. So we're on track. Okay, so as Greer said already, we had a chance to read through your items of feedback for monitoring and evaluation. And there were a couple of themes that stood out to me based on the feedback. One was this idea of baseline monitoring and evaluation. So in our adaptive management strategy, we said that no matter what, we want there to be a certain level of baseline monitoring and evaluation in each major river system. So that's regardless of what management regime we're in. We want there to be a certain baseline level, and that covers things like genetics and age structure sampling, and now creel, hopefully, and spawning ground surveys. So kind of the bread and butter, the things that we know we want for every system, those are in the baseline M&E. And so since the last time we all met, I drafted a more complete picture of what baseline M&E might look like. And so I want to give everyone an opportunity to read through that section of the draft, and we can talk about it more. I'm hoping we can talk about it more in the next meeting. But just for right now, just briefly, I was wondering if anyone had any kind of burning ideas or anything that they wanted to specifically talk about with regards to what baseline M&E should include. So feel free to raise your hand if you had any thoughts on that.
Go ahead, Jeff.
It's more of a question, Toby. I know James brought it up a little bit with the age, and I'm thinking also life history, but do you have an archive sample of otoliths from any sources in these systems? And I guess a follow-on would be, can you access heads from tribal harvest fish so you can maintain that kind of period of record?
Yeah, so we do. We have age structure data. The number of years of age structure data that we have depends on the system, but we do have data sharing going on with the tribes. So We have some samples that are from WDFW and some samples that are from the tribe. And actually one thing that I've been from the tribes, one thing that I've been working on a lot over the last couple of months is making sure that all of that age structure data that we have is really well organized and in one place. And I've had to do that because it's one of the parameters that we're inputting into the integrated population models for creating these additional forecasting tools. So yes, there is data right now. It's housed in a few different places. So I've just been going through the process of making sure that all the data we have is in one place. But we do have it. The amount of data we have depends on the system. And moving forward, I want to make sure that we have a systematic approach to collecting that data. So that we don't
Toby, sorry.
Yeah, go ahead, James.
I just want to say one more thing about Jeff's comment there. Use the word otolith, Jeff, and just so everybody's on the same page. Our primary tool for estimating age and life history. So did a fish move from freshwater to marine? At what age did it do it? Is scale analysis, right? And that's been the traditional tool. It's about the 50s. And, we also use otoliths. So everyone's clear on what we're talking about, the ear bone in fish that behave similarly to a scale, and that there's growth rings that we can use to understand the age. But to answer your question, we have otolith samples from very limited places, because usually we only collect otoliths if we have a very specific question that the scales can't answer. And just to mention this quickly, we've used otoliths in places in Hood Canal and the Nisqually River to validate our age analysis from the scales. We've also used it to understand what the life history of the mother was of the fish we collected the otoliths from. So there's kind of a big topic around otoliths, but the short answer is we don't collect otoliths as standard practice, because they require us sacrifice the fish or have a carcass. But if there's specific questions we learn here in this group that we need to be answering with otoliths, we would start that now, because that hasn't been done in the past. So, but good question.
Thank you, James. Jason, go ahead.
I guess this is a bit more of a zoomed out question / comment, but the thing that I've been kind of thinking about and going back and forth in my mind, with the monitoring and evaluation, is like trying to think about where that baseline is, and then I guess there's like the what are the regimes, the 3 regimes, right? And I guess I just keep thinking about if these things are changing, is the monitoring and evaluation going to be changing from year to year depending on what regime we're in? And if so, I don't know. I just find that to be a little confusing. I find it to be a little bit, I guess, almost wondering how is that going to be dramatically different from the status quo? And so I guess the questions I have are, can we, or is it possible, or is it ideal to make those monitoring and evaluation baselines as awesome as possible, sort of shoot for the sky, and why not just keep it that way? Fill all the data gaps that we can, and keep it that way. And I'd be curious to learn more about the sort of thinking behind that, or hear other people's thoughts about that.
Yeah, so thanks for your feedback there, Jason. I am hoping that the baseline will be a really comprehensive set of monitoring and evaluation tools, and the sort of proposed baseline that I put in the draft that I sent out a couple of weeks ago includes a lot of things that traditionally haven't been a given, right? They haven't been applied to all the systems. So the baseline that we're talking about here is more than the status quo or more than what has been done in the past. And that's especially true for expanding creel, which we've had a little bit on the Willapa now, but mostly just on the hoe in the past, a little bit on the Quileute, but the baseline would include creel for all rivers that are open, all of the major rivers that are open. And it would also be expanded spawning ground surveys. So increased capacity around spawning ground surveys, more personnel, and more coverage for spawning ground surveys. It also includes minimum numbers of genetic and age structure samples taken. And there are other aspects as well. But yeah, so I'm hoping that we can all like take a look at the document of what is in there now and kind of circle back on this one, because I just want to make sure that everyone's on the same page about what we're talking about in terms of baseline, based on that draft that I sent out. But I'm sure that we haven't all had a chance to read through that yet. So I want to circle back on that. One thing I will say is that in terms of shifting between multiple regimes, in the intermediate or transitional regime, we're thinking about having concentrated creel in that transitional regime, so that we can have more precision around our impact estimates. And I think this is going to be especially important for, populations that are not meeting escapement. We really want to be sure that we're not exceeding our impact limits in those systems, so we can get better understanding of our impacts by having increased creel. So basically that's what the transitional is saying, that we're going to do the baseline, yes, but we're going to expand creel if possible in systems that are not meeting escapement, so that we have more certainty around our impacts in those areas. And then in the conservation mode or the conservation focus regime, fisheries will be closed, right? So we can't expand creel there. But the idea there is that we would shift to expanding spawning ground surveys and or using sonar as an additional tool to understand escapement and run size, but also potentially as a sort of in-season tool. So that's what we're thinking. We want to have a really robust baseline. In transitional, we want to understand our impacts better because we're coming in under escapement. And in conservation, we want to take advantage of monitoring evaluation tools that we can still use even if fisheries are closed. So things like spawning ground surveys and sonar as well. So that's kind of my general thinking on that. I saw Jonathan had his hand up. Was there something you wanted to touch on there, Jonathan?
No, I mean, you brought up a good point about, and I appreciate it, about kind of running through it and, us coming back to you guys with questions we might have about, the specifics for this baseline. I mean, can we take that opportunity and do that now and kind of have you take us through it and talk a little bit more about it in detail?
I think we should save it for next time, just because we have a pretty packed agenda today, and I just want to make sure that everyone has a chance to really read through it thoroughly. But we'll put that on there for next time if you're okay with that.
Hey, and Toby, thanks for that. Jason, one quick follow-up here is that I'm really glad you brought this up, because if folks remember the first time we shared that management regime framework, we had it set up quite different. where we really relaxed M&E when stocks were abundant. And someone from the public at the end of the meeting, there's like 4 minutes for public comment, and someone brought up this, like identified this clearly as maybe a mistake. So, and I think they were right, and others too have identified it since then, is that's not really the time to relax monitoring fish. It's probably the time to just stay focused. And so the current sort of this, even the words baseline M&E is supposed to reflect that we really have this high level of M&E that occurs always. So thanks for flagging it, and kind of, we should stay on top of this one to make sure we don't end up relaxing it down the road.
Go ahead, Jason. Or Toby, did you want to add to it, or Jason, you want to respond?
I just want to say, James, I totally agree. I feel like if things are good, like, you know, if populations are looking good, like, let's be out there so we really have a good understanding of, you know, why they're doing good. And that was kind of my big worry, is almost that feeling of like, oh, things are good, so we can, like, you know, take it easy and focus elsewhere. And I feel like, no, if it's good, like, let's keep with it and like get as much understanding of what's going on as we can. So that's great. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, everybody. And I put a note down there to add this to the next agenda, and we can ask you all to kind of provide your input on what specifically you want to touch on besides what we are talking about today. Any other comments or questions related to baseline anemone? And as Toby said, we're going to keep moving through these, but I do want to capture any high-level comments or questions you have on each of them. And Olivia, I'll have you monitor the chat since I'm sharing my screen. So if someone puts something in the chat, just read it out to the group. And if not, we'll move on to test fisheries. Toby, do you need the screen back, or do you want to just keep moving through these on the, you do, okay, go ahead and steal it back.
Okay. Okay. So other topics that stood out from the feedback that I received on the M&E section were test fisheries and independent streams. And so Amy's going to talk a little bit more about this test fisheries idea, so I won't spend too much time on that right now. But the third one here, independent streams, is a really important one to talk about. So it's important to note that the baseline M&E that we're talking about applies to the major river systems on the coast, and there might be slightly different kind of standard protocols for monitoring and evaluation for independent streams. So we've been thinking about what to include here, but we're definitely in the preliminary phases of kind of drafting what that might look like for independent streams. So just wanted to flag that that's something that we're working on right now, and a more detailed description of that M&E in the independent streams will be in future draft that I'll send out that we can read through.
Toby, do you want to describe what independent streams are for anyone that might not know?
Yeah. So when I say independent streams, I'm talking about systems that are not part of these big watershed systems, the main ones that we're talking about. So places like Goodman Creek, Mosquito Creek, Mo Cliffs, all kinds of other smaller rivers that drain into the Pacific or into Grays Harbor or Willapa Bay that we don't focus as much attention on, either because there aren't fisheries there, aren't hatcheries there, or just because they're smaller in scale.
Thank you.
And just so folks recognize, Toby, I think you did a nice job explaining that. When we've shown in the town halls in the past, this cumulative abundance of wild steelhead that show up each year, it does not include these independent streams. It could, only be 20 to 100 fish in a given year, But the year that it's 0, you hope someone's keeping track of that, or the year that it's 4 times more than we've ever seen. So it's just worth noting, it's currently, there are not escapement estimates, formal escapement estimates for most of those systems. So we're trying to figure out what's the right place to include those that might be hundreds of miles of river. And we have some tools we're exploring to keep track of those, kind of keep your finger on the pulse. So, but I'm certain people in this room understand those streams better than myself for sure. Because only a few of those have I hiked around. So just want to make sure folks know we're thinking about it and excited to hear what people think.
Thanks, James and Toby. Toby, do you want to have folks provide you any input on independent streams, or do you want to switch over and talk about test streams and then gather feedback as a, on both of those together?
Yeah, so I know I didn't provide a lot of information on what we're thinking for independent streams, and that's because we're in the process of kind of drafting that right now. But I would like to hear if anyone has thoughts on kind of how we should consider these independent streams for a monitoring evaluation. If anyone has anything that they want to share right now, I'd be interested in hearing that.
Anything on monitoring and evaluation? Go ahead, Roy, on independent streams.
Yes, I just made a note here to myself to talk to James about the monitoring systems that they have in place now, and consider that as we're trying to build coursework with Huxley College and Peninsula College for students to do real field work under the supervision of people in the trade or professional area. And that would be an area that I would hope to study with someone about how we could have volunteer cadres really extend that. I'm looking at how we can build more experiences and usership for people of enjoying and studying and knowing about steelhead rather than just fishing only, which is my main passion for certainly, but how we can have more opportunities. I think that some of these that look like challenges for cost, I'd hope that we could guide our thinking to how we could build volunteer regimes and student research regimes to address and carry part of the burden of data collection.
Thank you, Roy.
Yeah, Roy, a network of volunteers would fit in just about perfect, I think, for a problem like this. So thanks.
Okay, Toby, I think we'll keep moving on in the interest of time, but I think if you have any feedback on independent streams, the chat might be a good place too to provide Toby feedback, or I think by email after this, because since it sounds like she's going to be drafting something, and Toby, is the intent to draft something and provide it back out, or will that just be end up in the plan?
It'll be in the plan. Yeah.
Okay, so it'll be another chance to look at what Toby comes up with at that point. Okay.
Yes, and not just me, the whole team.
Yeah, sorry.
Okay, so yeah, let's hear from someone else for a little bit. I'm going to turn it over to Amy to talk a little bit more about what we're thinking on this test fishery idea.
Yeah, so don't have a ton of time here, but again, this is something else that is really in the works and kind of an idea that we've thrown out, but now we're just kind of in the steps of really trying to figure out what would this look like actually implementing. So when we said test fisheries, what we were more thinking was actual looking at hook and line test fisheries, something kind of similar or inspired by kind of what you see in Puget Sound sampling or those kinds of things with their test and fish fishing and anglers. So what we'd look at is actually employing a WDFW employee, possibly 2, that would work full-time during the season. Essentially, the objective here would be to produce a standardized estimate of catch and harvest that's independent from Creel and the catch record cards and the guide log books, and it's going to be tracked over multiple years. This idea kind of getting, hopefully something that's more standardized that we can really hone in on when we're seeing changes between, say, CPUE or catch and those kinds of things. So as you see on the slide, we have a bit of a theoretical weekly schedule that, somebody would spend their week doing out on various streams. But one of the things that we're trying to narrow down on is what does that schedule look like? Weekday versus weekends, locations, are they dedicated to certain areas, potentially moving throughout the air, across different watersheds, kind of how much they interact with the guides, whether it's a we choose the guides or whether the guides are just voluntary, kind of the ratio of guided versus non-guided days. So like I said, this is something that we've been playing with as to how we can get some more usable in-season management tools based off of some data that we can collect that's in a more standardized manner. So yeah, I think with that, we'll kind of open it up and see if anybody else has some direct comments or ideas related to this, how we might be able to implement this in a usable way.
Thank you, Amy. Does anyone have any questions about what a test fisheries would look like and why it would be used, or have any input on how the department could use this? Go ahead, Jeff.
Yeah.
I think maybe I misunderstood the objective when I read about it in the M&E plan. And I see here you've got it clearly stated that the goal is a standardized estimate of catch. I think I was thinking about it from the perspective of another way to kind of track trends in abundance. So I would agree with you that the draft you've got here is aligned with your objective, but to me, if a secondary objective or if another actual objective is another way to estimate abundance in season in particular, instead of how many fish are being caught in tribal gill nets, then I think you're introducing too much variability with this design. I would think you would want the very best fishermen with the very best guides all the time, not moving them around, not trying to. So I would say you'd want to be extremely biased towards the very best.
Gotcha. And then I guess on top of that, thinking about scheduling, so would it be something where it would make sense for them to say the fishery only goes to the end of March, but they would continue then through the end of the run into June if we're looking at an abundance versus just the portion of the fishery?
Yeah, I mean, if your escapement estimate now is relying very heavily on red counts, right? So, or your assessment of escapement post-season. So I don't know. I mean, I start to get a little queasy thinking about catching those fish that time of year and potentially intercepting lots of kelts. So I don't know. I know I spoke with some people who've participated in the past in collecting data for the state, and the scale samples both sides of the fish, and they felt like the extra handling they were asked to do was pretty hard on the fish, and so they chose not to participate in that anymore. So I would think these folks, if you need that additional biological data, age data, scales, and things like that, obviously these folks would be trained to do it in the best way possible for the fish. But
Gotcha. Thanks, Jeff. Yeah, those are appreciate the feedback on kind of honing in on the objective and really making sure we have that in line with what we can do with this. So I think I saw Mara's hand come up next, but I know there's a few that are up there too. So
Mara's next.
Yeah, thanks. So question, I'm not understanding the guided boat versus non-guided boat, like what that is telling you here. And then the only other sort of thought on Jeff's suggestion here is that if you choose the folks that are the very best of the very best, they will find the fish every time, regardless of how large the run is. And so your index of like, is this abundant or not, it's not going to be what I think you want here, because you can have a small run, but folks who know exactly where the fish hang are going to get them every time. So that would just be a thought. It does seem like, and that kind of gets to my, like there's a element of like, in setting this up of how experienced the person is catching fish and keeping that consistent over time that is needed to to get this independent estimate that you're going for. So anyway, my question is, what's the guided, non-guided comparison that you're setting up here?
Yeah, and I think where that kind of stemmed from was thinking about the encounters potentially in the fishery as itself. And so, you know, we definitely have the non-guided would be, say that angler goes out separately by themselves and spends a day without having a guide helping them, you know, navigate down the river or that kind of portion of it as well. And so kind of trying to get, I guess I would say, our representative of the fishery in general. And so trying to, I guess, get at that more person that's just going to come out to the stream in order to float down the river. So some of that was, I think, potentially looking at pairing it up with some of the creel data to start doing some comparisons between what we're seeing in the creel as well as what we're seeing in the test fishery as far as encounter rates. So trying to, I guess, represent the catch rates or represent the encounter rates of not just our guided fishery, but also potentially novices or people that are not as familiar with the stream. But you're right, that's kind of it's always a hard thing that to kind of keep consistent amongst even the test fishers throughout the season. So yeah.
Mara, did that answer your question, Mara?
Did she jump off?
Yes, sorry, gave you a thumbs up.
Oh, okay, good. Just wanted to check back in. Okay, go ahead, Jonathan.
Yeah, Amy, has this program been used elsewhere around the state, or is this kind of the first of its kind out here?
It would probably be the first. I'm not aware of anybody else that's kind of done it. We've talked, James could correct me if I'm wrong, but we've talked with a few of the guys over on the east side who have looked at potentially doing this kind of over in the Columbia River system, but I don't know if they're continuing to do that. And then of course we have kind of representations of this in Puget Sound marine areas. But as far as freshwater, I'm not. And looks like Mars, like, yeah, the Cowlitz River Creel and test fishing study, but I'm not sure if that's continuing.
Yeah, so let me jump in. We did on the Columbia River, we've contracted with fishermen, paid fishermen to take Fish and Wildlife employees out fishing. And so it's only a couple of years in the pilot program to test some other equipment, cameras on board. So, but it is extremely new. And then that's why we're bringing it up here, brainstorming. The other thing I wanted to make sure Mara and Jeff, a piece of this that was important is the relationship between this estimate, this independent estimate, standardized estimate with abundance of steelhead is really unknown. And so the strength would come from lots of years of data to understand what is this data set telling us exactly. But we explored this with other people at fish management team about should we be trying to mirror this with an extremely advanced angler or a novice angler, someone that's never fished before. And there's flaws there with just inconsistency. So the more we've talked about it in our minds, it's become really an independent estimate of catch. And so we get an employee that sticks with the agency for a while and pays guides to take them out and fish on their own and put very few restrictions around what they do, where they go, and really act like a fisherman that wants to catch fish or fisher person. And we think that's where maybe the strength in just a long-term data set would tell us, is this a good estimate of abundance? Or is it a nice correction factor with what we're seeing in the creel? So we're not totally sure yet how this would look when the data comes in, but after multiple years, we think we'd see the strengths in it. Mm-hmm. So hopefully that helps with the thinking there.
Yeah, a little bit. I mean, do you see this being kind of a full, again, like system by system option that we'd be using in this, or would this be set up for only a specific river?
I think that's kind of where we're still working with that. And if you guys have thoughts or ideas, if you think that would be worthwhile, we'd love to hear that too, because that's an exact question that we've been asking is, does it make sense? Especially I think in areas like the Hoh and the Quileute where, certain days the Hoh is just not as fishable. You could be in the same vicinity where, certain rivers will be in shape while others won't. So you know, if say there's a week where the hose is blown out, but they can still go fish the sole duck, you know, do we want them to just not take that week off and not fish the hoe versus go try and get some effort in the sole duck and see how that goes because they're following the fishery? I don't know. So I think we're kind of working on that as well, and would appreciate some, I guess, outside thoughts and feedback. My idea is that it would more probably line up like with ongoing creel or say areas that are open and being actively creeled, but that's just kind of what I was initially thinking.
Yeah, this is Roy, and yeah, I have been a test fisher 60 years ago. I worked with Grizzly Tackle Company, and back when it was fisheries and game, and it was quite an extensive program. It'll be in the early 60s. I think this is a can of worms that is really a good one to open up and stir around in, but I don't think this is the right form and time. I think just to clarify that there's something we're looking for doing. I really encourage you strongly to organize a working group specifically on the concept of test fishery and get more angles of input, because it runs the risk of, you know, everything from some people getting an edge to go fishing more than others to flawed science because of the protocols that are established. It's a lot of detail in it. And I think it is an important aspect to collect data on. But as I look at this, I don't even see the sharpened question of what data we're looking for, you know, that anyone could catch it or how many fish are prevalent in the system. So I'd like to have it in the minutes that, you know, I'm recommending that we have a working group on the role of test fisheries and the design of them and the purposes. You know, it's a good idea. It's just one that can get partly done right and partly done wrong quite easily.
Gotcha. And that's where, yeah, that sounds good, Roy. And that's where I appreciate, you know, Jonathan's question too of us, you know, have we done this before? Can we learn from maybe some other groups and other folks that have done this previously to make sure that it's worthwhile?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I agree with what Roy said 100%. I mean, it's easy to, you know, get something like this out there. And, you know, it seems like you know, if you have this rolled up into the plan at a pretty basic level, it's a pretty, you know, easy PR win, right? Like, we're getting people involved. This is part of our plan. Let's do this. But I think to do this accurately and making sure that we're, you know, collecting all the necessary data and taking this opportunity, that needs to be kind of a well thought out kind of approach. So thank you though, Amy, appreciate that.
Sure. It looks like Rich has
Last question, and then we'll move on, but there will be a chance to continue to gather your feedback after this.
For sure. Yeah.
Go ahead, Rich.
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity to comment. I guess, you know, for me, it's a lot of questions associated with this, and I think that's okay. You know, a few things right off the bat when I look at this and think about it is, when is the fishery or test fishery occurring? Is this an in-season test fishery to get an idea of what the run size is? Or, you know, is it, you know, what time of year is this occurring? And again, I think there could be some problematic issues regarding the fact that, you know, some methods are a lot more effective than other methods. And so again, you know, it's interesting to think about this from the standpoint of success rates, right? Because, you know, if a person's out there swinging a fly for a fish, they're not going to be, you know, they're not going to be as effective as someone who is getting right into the slot and has the capacity to access those fish and know where they're sitting at, right? I just think there's some strange things with that. Also, you know, I don't know. I think there could be a public perception. There could be some problems from a public perception standpoint. And I think, you know, if you're considering this, I think you really need to address the social issue associated with it. So again, you know, if, like, say this fishery is occurring on a closed system, let's just say, you know, the fish behave a lot differently on a river that has a lot of people on it versus a river that doesn't have anybody on it. And, you know, so, you know, gosh, if you're considering doing something like this, I think you really have to be doing it from the standpoint of when, it's an open fishery, people are fishing, because the fish will just move around when there's pressure on the water. That's been my experience so much. So I'll just leave it at that. Those are my main comments.
Hey, Greer, before we move on, can I just tie a bow around this one? Because this is type of thinking, Rich and others, I really appreciate, and we're going to need it. So I want to remind everybody that as we increase monitoring and evaluation, so creel, and we have creel in every single river where we have a fishery taking place, we're going to rely heavily on that information to tell us, are catch rates high? Is there changes in abundance? Where is fishing good? Where is fishing bad? And that could change the way people report data when they start seeing creel reports online. And so we're talking really with this one bullet item is just one idea for having this independent estimate that allows us to really gauge what's going on in the river besides people's reports of what they caught. So it's kind of a separate estimate. So I'd like folks to keep exploring this, but also if you think of other ideas, to monitor catch in season outside of, creel interviews. Those would be helpful because it's going to be this creel work's going to become more and more important each year. So thanks.
Well, the other side of that, is there another way of looking at this too? Could you look at it from the standpoint of have certain individuals or have folks that are not necessarily working with you, but are reliable in that, you contacting, they're on the water a lot, and, each day they somehow give you a report or, do it real time or, do an interview by contacting you or something like that. Is there some other different ways of thinking about this as well?
Yeah, I think that's definitely another option too. And I know like with the guide logbook system we have set up and some of the other things that could be another possibility.
Yeah, because
avenue of data, but yeah.
Yeah, because I know even doing scale samples, like sometimes we've had public involved in helping do scale samples. And again, you just don't unleash somebody to go out there and start doing a scale sample, right? It's usually with somebody that's given some instruction and training. But, it could be a similar thing where you have specific anglers that are trained in kind of what you're looking for, and they can help gauge success or something. I don't know. I'm just trying to think of different ways to do this.
Yeah,
So.
yeah. I think the key there is building the relationships and having some folks that we can depend upon and are representative and kind of fit all the specific niches that we need. So, but yeah, I really appreciate it. I think we're definitely getting on the edge of time here, but yeah, I really appreciate the feedback on this from everybody.
Okay. Thank you.
Thanks. And I'm capturing live notes today throughout the meeting, and I may or may not hear you exactly right. So Olivia's going to drop the link in the chat, and that's a SharePoint link for advisory group members. So if I don't get it right, or if you want to add while we're talking and you have other thoughts, feel free to just drop it right in that live document, and that will kind of provide a summary of some of the discussion today that's outside of the official summary. It just provides a more point-by-point list of discussion points for each topic. So with that, I'm going to hand it back to you, Toby, to shift directions. Are we going to do the report out first? Olivia, will you remind me what's first on our agenda for the fisheries regulations? Let me just pull it up. Homework report out. Yes. So this is on me. So what we're going to do is if you would like to share your report out with the whole group in the meeting, we'd love to hear from you all. So as a reminder here, thank you, Toby. Here's a reminder of what you were asked to consider after our last meeting. So we'll just go in order of whoever wants to raise their hand and report out to the group. We'll try to keep it brief just so we get through all of our discussion topics today, but we'd love to hear from you. So whoever wants to kick us off and raise the hand, go for it. Go ahead, Roy. Thank you for stepping up first, stepping to the plate first.
I'll be the wildest guy out here. I'm eager to expand the work we do, and I know it's going to be regulated from a lot of decisions made at levels beyond this work group with co-managers and such. But mine was to consider the Dickey River as a river that I'm fairly familiar with, and come down, hike down from the East Fork all the way down, and been up and down it a lot, row up it from the bridge. And my recommendation for changing practice would be to close the Dickey for 5 years to sports fishing, and negotiate with our co-managers to not have a gillnet fishery downstream from the Dickey, which would mean up near Mora Park. And it would give us an area a little more dynamic than Mosquito Creek or Goodman Creek to consider what happens in a system where there is no fishing and there's monitoring, or there's test fisheries and frequent surveys, and a subject of intense study and monitoring for habitat restoration, abundance, and all the elements, and make it like a petri dish to study all of the systems on the coast. It's near the salt water. It's only about 4 sets that the tribe has got between the Dickey and down at the harbor. Everything happens up at Rich Wines and in that area. So it's an idea that if we took one of the systems that was not as high volume usership like the Dickey, and really set it off and tried some of our more extreme efforts to see what might really make a difference, because a little bit of this and a little bit of that in so many arenas hodgepodges up. I think if we took the Dickey and really looked at making that a test site because of its location and because it's a low usership and access, it'd be a bold move. I know we're a long ways from the policy and co-manager discussions to get to that, but that's, you know, a big bite where there's not a gill netting impact, where there's not a sports fishing, where there's not a hatchery introduction, and we look at what the riparian zones are performing like, and the sedimentation and water quality and sedimentation fill and all the issues, and just look at a river like that. It's a wonderful little river. I'll call that done.
Thank you, Roy. Who's next? And Olivia's going to paste the homework assignment in case you need to read it while you're talking into the chat, so that I like seeing everyone's faces. So thank you for being on camera during this discussion. Anyone else want to share, report out on their homework? Go ahead, Luke. Thank you. Oh, you're on mute.
Sorry, I got so many buttons over here. Yeah, so I live on the Willapa. That's the one I pick. It's a very interesting question. I am of the mind that hatcheries do more bad than good. So I would love to be able to, you know, look at a lot of the science that we have seen, and I guess when it all comes down to it, really trust science. So even in terms of like the socioeconomics and, you know, all of the things, I think we need to look at what science tells us and not what we want to do. And, you know, if we had to balance the fishery with, you know, so anglers can get out there, I know it's a little hypocritical, but I do think that, you know, fish need advocates. So I not necessarily one to say like, let's completely shut it down. But, you know, I think we should consider alternative ways of limiting, you know, even just the hookups. So like, you know, I'm down here on the river and I'm seeing fish handled poorly. People just don't care. You know, they're flopping on the beach. It's just, you know, people are getting their picture. It's, you know, it's just not good for the fish. So if I was to you know, trying to make a compromise, I maybe would say, hey, let's maybe a limited number of, you know, fish caught per year. I know you kind of have to be on the honor system on that, but when I see people are like, yeah, I went out and got 6, 7, 8 fish this weekend, part of me wants to cry a little bit. So, I think maybe, come up with a number of like, hey, maybe one and done or something like that.
Thank you, Luke. Appreciate you sharing today. Anyone else want to share out on this homework assignment, and even, just generally any feedback related to the questions? How are fisheries regulations impacting rivers? Go ahead, Jeff.
I like Roy's idea. I have a question for the state, or maybe Roy knows. Is there spine survey data for the Dickey system now? Any historical data?
Yeah, there is.
Okay.
Yeah, and we can share that, but it's not going to be, what you see in some of these other major systems, but it's going to be a lot better than the ones like Toby provided some examples of these independent streams that drain directly into the ocean. So yeah, we do have limited information for that system. But I think I agree. I'll just say, since I got my mic on now, Jeff, I'll say I agree with Roy too, that it's a good idea, to really dig into, some of these systems really tight. So, but I'll pass the mic back to you, Jeff.
Did you want to report out, Jeff, or just wanted to ask that question?
I just wanted to ask that question. I don't have the experience on these rivers that really probably anybody in this group does. So I've spent a little time out there, but I have a lot of respect for Roy and those who know those systems. So I'm happy to chip in where I can.
Thank you. Go ahead, Mara.
Yeah, thanks. Let me pull up my comments here. I guess in answering this, I did want to start with just a general comment on the emergency fishery regulations. Felt like I needed to get that out before I answer the specific question, which is, I do support measures to reduce fishing impact on steelhead when the run sizes are low, but I don't think that these measures are enough to solve the problem. And I see these as sort of last-ditch attempt to keep steelhead from going over a cliff, but we really need a better understanding of how to pull them back from that cliff entirely. And so I just wanted to sort of start my comment with, with that point. That said, I have some input on the emergency fishery regulations that have been proposed from my perspective as angler and also a taxpayer. And I just wanted to preface my comment. I'm primarily a bank angler. With respect to river closures, in my subjective experience, the river by river closures affect fishing effort on the rivers that remain open. And I say this based on the hours I've spent fishing the Hoh River, both when the Skagit fishery is closed and the few years that it has recently been open. And my experience has been when that Skagit fishery is open, I run into far fewer anglers and boats on the Hoh River. And I realize that there's no hard data to quantify that kind of reallocation of fishing effort at the moment. And for that reason, I would recommend, as if we're doing that sort of river by river closure, really making sure we have solid creel, or even like making sure we have implementing a more like that cost-effective electronic catch record cards in the rivers that remain open, making sure that that's really being tracked. Another thing I wanted to comment on was the no fishing from a boat rule. I have spoken with multiple anglers who feel that their fishing experience was actually improved under no fishing from a boat regulation. And this feedback came from both guides and individual anglers. And the assumed reasons they gave me varied from that there were fewer encounters and this made the fish more aggressive, to fewer people out on the river overall because of the sort of changes in fishing regulation. Because of this input is contrary to much of what I've heard during public comment, I did want to offer it as you're sort of considering the impacts of these different emergency regulations going forward. And finally, also going back to river closures for fisheries. As a taxpayer, I find river closures particularly problematic on rivers with substantial hatchery production. In my view, the purpose of a hatchery fish is to support the fishery. I can't find the science that supports the idea that spawning hatchery fish contribute getting unstable internet. I can't find the science to support that the idea that the spawning hatchery fish contribute to the next cohort that's coming out of the gravel. And in some cases, I do see science support to say that those spawning hatchery fish will reduce the next cohort of wild fish coming out of the gravel. So that said, closing rivers like the Wainuchi River means that a large number of returning hatchery fish aren't used, either as broodstock or in the harvest. And so kind of from that taxpayer perspective, it leaves me with a bit of heartburn knowing how expensive the programs are to run. And so my thought here is a recommendation: if the river closures sort of continue as a tool in this suite of actions, my recommendation is that this be coupled with companion scaling of our hatchery programs to ensure that public funds are being wisely spent. And I know that's the direction, or it looks like that's the direction that you're headed, and I would fully support that, that direction. So thanks for considering the comments.
Thank you, Mara. That was super efficient. I appreciate that. Thank you. Go ahead, Roy. We'll just keep running through them.
I appreciate Mara's remarks always. And in reading the state Steelhead Management Plan carefully, starting at the back and going through all the definitions and coming at it from that angle, it seems like there's kind of a denigration of what the quality of gene structure is for wild stock survival and their unique adaptive natures and their unique watersheds. And that's why I was earlier mentioning the Dickey, is it has had low or no hatchery off and on for quite a while. It's a low adulterated system. And I just worry about that hatchery overflow. So I agree with Mara, when you close one river, it puts more guys on another river, but the Dickey's a low count river and also has less of a history of hatchery influence over the last decade or so. I think some of the staff could clarify that further than I could, but I agree with keeping track of the wild fish.
Thank you, Roy. Go ahead, Jason.
I don't have a whole lot new to add there to what Mara said. I've found so far in this process that Mara seems to express a lot of these ideas that I want to express much better than I could in most cases. But I'll just say that in thinking about this homework, I moved to, I grew up in the Olympia area, but I lived away from here for a while. Moved to Olympia about 5 years ago, and just got the chance to sort of start exploring the Wainuchi and Satsup, for a couple of years before it closed, before those rivers have closed down the last couple of years, or closed early, and which has really bummed me out, because I would like to learn more about those rivers and sort of get that on the ground knowledge, just not just like, where can I catch a fish, but also like, where are the guides going to be at different times, and where are the other anglers going to be at different times, and things like that. The kind of stuff I fished a lot on the peninsula, on the west side, and even guided out there a couple of years, and kind of got to know that pretty well. And so I guess I would just say that I hope that when these fisheries do open up back here, that we're conservative about it, and hopefully able to like bring in this really robust data collection, monitoring and evaluation, and kind of put the focus on seeing where those things go as the rivers do open back up. And not just my sense of like the Wainuchi, for example, is that every time I've been out there, it just seems like a free-for-all with like boats running up and down the river and tons of people. And when I see that kind of thing, it kind of scares me a bit. Seems like the Wild West. And so I guess that's what I have to add there. And I hope as I learn more about those rivers that I kind of consider my home rivers now, that I'll be able to give more there. So
Thank you, Jason. So we're going to move to our topics of interest, but I know some of you may also want to go ahead, Rich, and then we're going to shift to the discussion so we make sure to fit it in before our break. Go ahead. Oh, you're on mute.
Yeah, thanks again. I appreciate it. You know, I really appreciate Mara's comments and as well as Luke's, and you know, even Roy had some really great points. One of the things, a couple things, you know, I was around when we were really pushing for a catch and release regulation on the rivers. That's what started the organization back in 2000. We finally got to where the commission listened to us, and we got it where they did tried to do a temporary moratorium of harvesting wild steelhead. And out of that came a directive from the commission to develop the statewide steelhead management plan. And there was people I know, and as far as staff and others, we even had it reviewed by a scientific community. And you know, that was 2004, and it took until 2008 to develop the steelhead management plan. And from what I've seen is it's kind of sat there, it seems like to me, and it seems like only in the last number of years that we really started looking at that and taking that seriously. And to me, it's like actually really utilizing that plan, because there's good content in it. And, you know, my argument would be it needs to be even changed a little bit, because before that, when it was developed, Puget Sound steelhead weren't even listed yet, you know, and things have changed quite a bit since 2008. So that's one thing I just want to bring into perspective. Again, I believe that we got to have better handling of the fish. We got to keep their heads under the water. We got to handle the fish better. It's impacting their productivity. It's impacting, it really ups our mortality rate. And I think that's something. And also lowering the counter rates. I know you can't do it, it's hard. But again, the days of going out and thinking you're going to rope, you know, 6 steelhead for the day, it's kind of over with. I mean, it's about sharing kind of the resource and, you know, being happy with catching a couple fish for the day, you know, and enjoying it instead of being in a competition. I'd like to see it something a little differently be thought about. How do you manage for fishing a wild steelhead gene bank? You know, you look at a river like the Salduck, and it seems to be the backbone that's carrying the Quileute right now from a wild steelhead standpoint. And so how do you think about how you conduct a fishery on that system? I would argue that the Hoe should be a wild steelhead gene bank. I know there's a tribal hatchery at the mouth, but I think it's probably something that's should be considered. Again, I think there's some lessons to learn from some classified waters models. And so I'll just leave it at that. And I appreciate the time.
Thank you, Rich. Bob, did you want to briefly add anything?
Yeah, hopefully you guys can hear me. I know my internet's a little bit unstable at the moment.
You're good.
Okay. So, yeah, I mean, I've thought long and hard about this particular homework assignment, and it's a really hard one. And I recognize the fact that, you know, there are more people on the coast now, and we definitely need to have some regulations that limit some things, slow the catch rates down a little bit. But I also had a hard time looking at that. And when I look at other resources, I mean, we're talking about the peninsula, and we're looking at all the things that we can do here on the peninsula. And I looked at not only the peninsula, but I looked at all these other streams, not just here, but all over the place. You know, we talk about the no fishing from a floating device rule. The Deschutes River has been a no fishing from a floating device rule for 30 years. It's closed this year because the steelhead runs are in horrible shape. So could you say that the fishing from a floating device rule was a great impact and really help the system? I would say probably not. It's probably more of a socially economical thing. A lot of the rivers in Canada have been no fishing from floating devices. They've had stricter regulations put on those streams. You know, a lot of the Skeena system, a lot of the places up there have had pretty significant cuts back quite a few years ago. All those streams right now are in the tank. And so I look at it and say, okay, we need to trim back on our regulations, but at the same time, you know, is it really going to make the impact that we have to for these fish, right? Are changing these regulations and lessening the number of fish we touch and the way we fish for them and so forth, are they really going to make the impacts that we need to help, as Mara said, keep these fish from falling over a cliff? And I'm not positive that there are, because I haven't seen a lot of the evidence in places where we have made really strict regulation changes, where you've seen a real positive turnaround of the steelhead population. And so then I look at it from a socially economical side of things. You know, biologically, what is that happening? But socially, yes, if we limit people and we take people out of their boats and we make it harder, we're going to have less fishermen. And so as we have less fishermen, people are going to, you know, for some people, they're going to enjoy themselves better on the water. And for some people, it's going to increase their productivity, you know, just because there's less people there catching less fish. And so therefore, it's going to change that. Therefore, people would say, oh, look, by doing that, we really helped. I don't know that we really helped. Socially, economically, we helped, but I'm not sure that we helped like in a biological standpoint. So I just kind of looked at that. And as I'm looking at these regulations, I'm all for changing some regulations. But at the same time, I also recognize how many people, you know, just, okay, I'll take the fishing from a floating device rule. How many people that did eliminate from the fishery? There was a whole lot of them that, you know, got eliminated from the fishery because of it. And so is that something that we really want to do? So where do we make sure that we have access for those folks? Also making sure we have access on the other side too, where we make some conservative deals. And then, you know, Mara brought up the hatcheries and so forth. So you look at a system like the Chehalis system, that was kind of the system I chose. And I kind of chose it, and I'll be honest with you, I'm not a Chehalis River fisherman. I'm a North Coast fisherman. I fish the sole duck in the Cumulative system. But I reached out to a lot of people about that. Partly I look at that is because the Cumulative system and the hose system are probably the better of all the systems. They seem to be holding their own a little bit. They're not falling under the ceiling like the Chehalis system and the Hump Tulip system and those places. So to me, I look at those and say, man, those are the ones we really got to get under control. And so by looking at that, with us not having any fishing at all on those systems, we do have to look at those hatcheries, and we have to look at what they're doing and where all those hatchery fish are at. And I believe there's an opportunity to keep people engaged, to be able to access those hatchery fish and so forth. So looking into all the data I've looked at and talking to a bunch of folks, you know, you could have a fishery on the Wainuchi through about February 15th from the 7400 line downriver and really have minimal interactions with wild fish, very minimal actions with wild fish, capitalizing on all of those hatchery fish that are showing up there. You know, the Satsup's, its neighboring river, it has a little healthier wild population. So I think you'd have to be out of there, you know, from Schaefer Bridge down to the highway bridge. You could have a fishery and get people out of there by January 15th and have very minimal interaction with wild fish. You know, we had a tremendous return to the Skookum Chef this year with huge amounts of hatchery fish showing up. And I think if you set up a fishery that was like a mile, maybe a mile and a half downstream from the hatchery, where you could have access to those fish, and those fish run actually later and still have pretty minimal impacts on the wild fish that would be in that system. This would have access for all those folks that want to go catch a hatchery fish. It's going to remove a bunch of hatchery fish from the system. It's going to provide opportunity for folks. I agree with Mara. When you provide opportunity, you provide the spreading of people and the increased pressure in other places. And so by providing that opportunity in those systems, you are going to not spread the pressure to other areas, right? So I think that's super important. The hump tulip system, its neighboring river, it's an early timed hatchery fish. You could have a fishery from the highway bridge downstream, and by January 15th, close it. You're gonna have minimal impact on those wild fish, and same thing, you're gonna get the hatchery fish out of there. I just think those would be really good, and it would, like Mara said, yeah, the taxpayers would be getting their benefit from what we're paying for, and it provide an opportunity, provide less spreading of everywhere. And I think we could do it with minimal impacts to those wild fish. And I would keep the rest of the Chehalis system, closed. Keep the Chehalis closed, keep the rest of the tributaries closed. Just allow those little fisheries in the Wainuchi, short one in the Satsup, and the Skookumchuck, and keep them on a limited basis. I think those would work well in doing that. So just those are my thoughts. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Bob. I appreciate all the work you put into that. And I think the advisory group appreciates your feedback. So great input. And if anyone wanted to follow up on what Bob said or continue this conversation, go ahead, Roy. Oh, you're on mute.
I agree with Bob greatly on that. I don't know, Bob better than I knows how many fish were in the Bogoshiel pond this year. They're just right in the hatchery there, 3,000 I heard. And how to exercise the opportunity for that usership where the hatchery programs are robust and established. And I hate to say it, triaging as it may be, that the wild steelhead survival in some of those systems is a lot more questionable than in other rivers. And to concentrate on the rivers where the wild stock can be protected as with extreme of regulatory processes we might want to come up with. And at the same time, really point to and guide people to that usership where there is already a hatchery denigration in the gene pool. And I hate saying write it off, but I did the data collection on the second dam in the Cowlitz in 1966. And I did test fisheries on the Tilton and the Cispus and all the upper tribs that were above Mayfield Dam. And I fished that Blue Creek, and I ran a 20-foot sled up and down that river for spring salmon and steelhead. And it's a high producer, but even the hatchery denigration of the gene pool has sort of warped that scene a little bit too. But I agree about concentrating where there's hatchery stocks and helping people get there.
Thank you, Roy. So in the interest of time, we're about halfway through. I'm going to let us take a 5-minute break. And then we're going to come back. And we actually, when I look at the list of topics we were going to cover under this and that you all had recommended or provided through your comments, we've touched on a lot of them. So you have the link to the live document if you want to plug in your own notes into any of those topics of interest, like feedback to DFW or questions you have. We can open that up after the 5-minute break and leave it open for the rest of the meeting as the place where you can house your comments or questions. And if we have time, we can circle back to those discussion topics. And I also will circle back and just touch base with both DFW and the advisory group on if there's any topics within that list you want to spend a little bit of time on before we transition to our discussion of hatcheries, which we've already started discussing now. So 5-minute break. If you can come back, actually, let's just make it 6:50, a nice round number. So I'll give you about 8 minutes to take a break, grab some food if you need some dinner, a bio break, and then we'll be back here at 6:50. Thank you, everybody.
Hey, good to see you on the screen there, Chris.
Thanks, Roy. Yeah, I meant to say hi to Chris. Welcome him. Tell him we're jealous he's in Hawaii, I think, is where he is.
Yeah, sorry, I landed late, and then getting to downtown Waikiki is quite the process at rush hour. But
Yeah,
I'm here.
glad you made it. Plenty of time to have you participate, so thank you. We'll let you
Yep.
catch your breath during this break.
Okay, sounds good.
Okay, there we go. All right, welcome back, everybody. We're gonna go back to our agenda, and I wanna make sure, although we're a little behind time, I do wanna allow a little bit of time if we can for any of these discussion topic of interest before moving on to hatchery operations. We did touch on a few of them, but I did wanna make sure I asked both DFW and advisory group members if you wanted to spend any time on these. Go ahead, Jason, and then Jonathan.
Just a quick question. Does it work for us to leave comments in that live agenda that you guys are adding stuff to?
Yes, so that
Okay.
live link is a SharePoint file, and it's meant to, we can use it during the meeting or after the meeting, but it's just a place to capture another place to capture feedback. So yes, please,
Well-
during the meeting is great too. We can go back to that whenever we need to. Go ahead, Jonathan.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I mean, there's a couple things on that list, I think, that it would probably be beneficial to, still run through as a group. There was I think the Q&A one about the communication with the co-managers during the regulation setting process. And, I'd definitely be interested to kind of hear from staff about that one. And then additionally, the, considerations for resident rainbow trout and regulations around that. As we all know, those are, resident rainbow trout populations are, contributing to these populations of steelhead. And then I think, let me see here, I don't have that list in front. Oh yeah, then the other piece too, and this kind of gets at the town hall meetings moving into the future and how useful are the town hall meetings. I guess my understanding is that once this plan was, developed and put together, that would allow us, or I should say, allow the department to move away from having like 4 or I think last year was 4 or 5 town hall meetings leading up to the season, which, as most people know, it's an extensive use of resources and time to pull those together and, talk about these regulation considerations. So kind of a lot there, but I'll leave it at that.
So it sounded like, Jonathan, you're suggesting the town hall, resident rainbow, sorry, what was the last one off this list on the screen?
There was I think it was under it was the co-manager communication with regards to the regulation setting process.
Perfect.
Yeah, and I just wanted to flag, Greer, Jonathan, thanks, by the way. I just wanted to flag that these agenda topics, discussion topics were provided by advisors. If folks are wondering why these are on there and some aren't, these, Toby can correct me if I'm wrong, but these weren't our ideas, but just good ideas that we heard from people. So it's really up to folks here that want to provide feedback on that. So thanks.
Thank you, James. Yeah, this was a little bit of a compilation of looking at the comments, hearing from folks, and then just asking the department what they wanted to hear about. So thank you. So I have those 3 there. Go ahead, Bob.
Yeah, I don't know if it was the right place for him or not, but one of the questions you guys asked in the last one was other regulations that might take into effect or looked at. And I know something that we proposed this last year was to possibly have a time frame on the water. So like maybe you fish until 1 o'clock or 1:30 or 2 or whatever, and then everybody comes off the water. That would limit the number of people out there instead of, I know that when we went to no fishing from a floating device, our amount of time on the water skyrocketed. A lot more time spent, a lot of people spent a lot more time on the water. And so that could be used as a rule. Down on the Columbia here, you know, in a sturgeon fishery, we have to quit fishing for sturgeon at 2 o'clock. Lines out of the water at 2. Then we can go salmon fishing or something, but we can't fish for sturgeon anymore. So it is something that we could look at, you know, in some of these fisheries, to where we allow people on the water, but then we get them off the water at a certain time frame, would limit the amount of interaction with the fish. And it's just a pretty simple rule. You're done fishing at 2. And even if you're on the water, there's no lines on the water, you're just rowing off, or you're walking out or whatever. And that would eliminate people from being out there for 10 hours or 12 hours trying to catch as many as they can. So just a thought.
Great. So on that vein, any other suggested regulations that you haven't seen discussed thus far? And we'll kind of stay on that topic, and then we'll move to the few others that have been suggested today. Go ahead, Jeff.
Yeah, another topic that's come up, but we haven't really talked about it much, of limiting time on the water, is limited entry. So lottery system, whatever. If it's a situation where the expected return is not good, and you want to have a fishery, put another way to limit entry.
Thanks, Jeff. Go ahead, Jason.
Oh, sorry, I wasn't muted. Am very much into, you know, sort of limiting our impact. But I'll just add, you know, in my mind, I want to limit our impact until we have a much better idea of you know, how our impact is you know, affecting the fish. You know, if we you know, Bob was mentioning the fishing from boats, and you know, I would say, you know, if it turns out in a few years or whatever that fishing from a floating device or not fishing from a floating device doesn't, you know, actually affect what's going on, then like let's not bother with it anymore. But I do think it would be really great if we could spend some time with some of these regulations, kind of like trying to sort of have everybody step back from the water a little bit and learn more about what's going on, and then make the decision whether to keep something or not, rather than, you know, because I totally get what Bob is saying, that, you know, the no fishing from boats thing took people off the water here and there, and some people really loved it, and I'm one of those people. I love the fact that there wasn't, you know, 15 boats fishing through the water in front of me. That's maybe an exaggeration, but you know, I know that some people didn't love it, and I think that you know, figuring out whether or not it's something that is useful and needed would be good. And so not just kind of like flip-flopping and going back from year to year, but actually like putting a few of these things in place and seeing what happens. That's really what I want to see, and what a lot of people that I've talked to would like to see, is just taking time to, you know, understand how these changes might affect things and whether they're good or not good. And, you know, of course, you know, keeping the fish's health sort of first and foremost, but, you know, right along with, you know, what the guides and everybody else are doing out there in all of these rivers. So.
Thank you, Jason. Go ahead.
Gary, do you mind if I jump in?
Please do.
Jason, thanks for the comments, and a bunch of other people's comments here are reminding me that this baseline M&E that we talked about at the very beginning will allow us to evaluate some of these things, like shifts in effort that Mara talked about, changes in regulations and how they affect, you know, encounters. And so I'm just mentally linking this idea that if we have baseline M&E that's sufficient across the area, then we may be able to test some of these other things that people are bringing up. So thanks for letting me share that.
Thanks, James. Go ahead, Luke.
Yeah, I am. I'm just sort of continuing to think outside the box, and I mentioned it earlier. Like, what about a one and done or a limited number of hookups or fish landed per season and of course it has to be on the honor system, but just if we're really trying to limit the number of encounters with fish, it still gives people the fun day with a guide down the river and catching a few, but then maybe taking a break for the rest of the season. I don't know, it's I do agree that I feel like the regs probably aren't as big of an impact as some of the other things that could be done. So I understand that argument 100%. But I think what we're tasked with doing here is doing the best that we can with what we can do. So.
Thank you, Luke. Go ahead, Toby.
Thanks, Gary. I just wanted to make sure that we responded to Jonathan's question about the co-manager process and communication, because that was a Q&A item that we had on the agenda. So just wanted to talk a little bit about that, and then James, you can jump in if there's anything that I missed on that as well. But just wanted to talk a little bit about the timeline of how we're sharing information with our co-managers. So after we finish up our spawning ground surveys, in the spring and early summer, we have a process of data exchange, usually in July with our co-managers. And then by August, we try to have our escapement numbers finalized for Steelhead. And then in that early fall time period is when we start working on our forecasts, and we exchange forecasts with the co-managers. So in some cases, we have a variety of forecast methodologies that we use, and we talk through those with our co-managers. And then in October, we come to forecast agreements and determine management plans for fisheries, for the steelhead fisheries with our co-managers. And then the fisheries regulations that we set, of course, are just regulations that are for the state 50% of the run size. So just wanted to throw those that timeline out there a little bit. And James, let me know if there's anything else you want to add there.
Yeah, I just add for Jonathan's comment there, it's also linked to the town hall meetings, because we know, so I really appreciate, Jonathan, you being sensitive to the late nights that go into preparing for those. I really appreciate you commenting on that. It's a huge workload, but one thing we did find, I'm not one to advocate for lots of meetings late into the night, but one help that for us as fish managers was that we would walk into the tribal co-management room with more insight into regulations or rules or packages that the public wanted us to fight for. And so, some years that's more valuable than others, but we did get a little bit of insight from the public that I think I didn't used to get 4 or 5 years ago. So open to fewer town halls, but also see the value. So maybe there's a sweet spot there. So thanks, Toby.
So James, real quickly, as of now, then moving forward, you still, I guess, as this all shakes out, you still anticipate having kind of maybe the similar amount of town halls, or just a little bit fewer, or what's your sense there?
Well, knowing that my boss is probably listening to what I'm committing to right now, I'm a little hesitant, but I will say part of this proviso implementation work does have an aspect of it that's communication with the public that, is really important. And I'd say that was a flaw to our management strategy 4 or 5 years ago. We really lacked that. So I don't know what the right fit is, but my expectation is at least a couple town halls as the rubber hits the road there. We get forecasts in hand. We agreed to them with tribal co-managers. I do need, and the team needs, a way to communicate what we're seeing with the public. And the minute things start looking better for wild steelhead, I want to be there telling folks about it. So Yeah, so short answer, yeah, there'll be some kind of formal avenue to communicate to the public, probably using town halls.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Any other questions or feedback related to co-manager communication or town hall meetings or the other regulations? We'll kind of try to get as much as we can in the time we have. Go ahead, Rich, and then Bob.
Hi, thanks. I just want to comment on Bob's idea about the time frame on the water. Bob, I'd like to say, could you just make it more gentleman hours? You know, from 9 to 5. So, you know, again, you know, I think what I always like to see is trying to keep the fishery from behaving in a form of a Oklahoma land grab, right? And because that just doesn't produce a pleasant experience for anybody. It increases competition, encourages etiquette infringement. I mean, all these things, and it's just not a pleasant experience. So I'll look at that from the social element, right? And again, now I always go back to like, how do you share the resource among the users? And I think that's a really important things to kind of keep in mind. But you know, one thing that a lot of people have talked to me about, and you guys have probably heard about it too, is like, how come we don't think in terms of how we manage the fisheries from an experiential standpoint? And perhaps it's more based on some of the hunting model that happens in the state and elsewhere, right? And where, you know, for lack of a better term, you know, you put your name in and you draw a permit to fish, and you control the number of people that way and counter rates or whatever. But I think there's something there, and it seems like there's a lot of people that seem to talk about that. And I don't know what it looks like. I just think it's something to think about and consider. And again, I can't say enough, but instead of consideration for resident rainbow trout, I think we need to, for lack of a better term, protect them. You know, how do we, in our fishery, protect resident rainbow trout? And, you know, I think they're probably a little bit more vulnerable during the summer months. So I think that's really something important. I think especially on the West Coast, we really need to protect that life history of steelhead, because they do pick up the slack when we're seeing some of the situations occurring now where we have less steelhead returning, and some of those fish are helping pick up the slack. So I think that's a really important thing to think about. So I'll just leave it at that. Thanks again.
Thanks, Rich. Go ahead, Bob.
Yeah, Rich threw me off. I had a whole bunch of stuff, and then he made comments and threw me off my comments. But
Sorry,
I guess
Bob.
I did. That's all right, Rich. I guess I did have a question. James, you can answer this if you want, or not. I've asked a couple different times, as you know, I've been involved in this for a long time, and up until about 2 or 3 years ago, we used to be privy to co-managers' numbers, how many they caught, you know, what, you know, more information from them. As of recently, when asked, you referred to the idea of like, well, we can't really share that. So if you want the information, you have to call them and see those numbers, right? Before, we always had that. If I asked a biologist, you know, hey, how many fish did they catch last week? Or how many of the fish they caught so far? And they would tell me what they knew. And it seems like that's changed. And I've asked 2 or 3 different people from the department yet if there's been a change in the policy and or from the tribal side. And I really haven't got an answer from it. But I have checked with biologists from other parts of the state that said that is not a policy change for them. And they openly share what their tribal numbers are doing. And it's all part of the management of our fish. And so when you're putting it out there, you know, some of the questions you're asking us, is we're simply focused on that. And I don't think there's one person in this entire advisory group that would be a tribal basher, say anything bad about the tribes or anything, but for us to actively manage the fish and to actively talk about what we're going to do to help save these fish, as Mara would say, go off a cliff, then it should be part of the discussion. Maybe not in this group right here, but at some point in time, part of the discussion. And knowing what they're catching and knowing how they're doing some of their things are important aspects of it. And we could give some feedback or some ideas. And so I guess I'm asking if there's been some kind of shift, because it was never an issue before.
Yeah, thanks. It's a pretty short answer. No change in policy. Legally, working for the state, we're required to get permission from the tribe before we share tribal catch data. That's not a state policy. This is a legal, sort of policy that we cannot share tribal data. There's sovereign government. That hasn't changed. But what I will say is in South Puget Sound, Hood Canal, Chehalis, the coast, really the climate there for sharing tribal data varies. Some of our tribal co-managers are extremely comfortable with it and others aren't. So what you will see is the last few years since I've been here, we've had agreement to share these preseason fishing schedules online. And then last year in the town hall, we shared tribal catch data and, summary tables. So I think we're making, solid ground there with sharing, but I've never been in a situation working for the state where I could share tribal data. And so if there's without their permission. So maybe there's other biologists or managers that have been more effective at that than me, but no change to policy.
Okay,
Thank you,
thanks.
Bob. Thank you, James. Rich,
Yeah.
you're going to be our final comment before we have to ship to hatcheries.
Okay, I'll be short. James, probably a question for James is, and I think Bob hit on it and Jonathan did, especially on the transparency part, but how are the sport fisheries on in the tribal sector? How is that accounted for? Because there are sport fisheries like on the lower Quinault, we have it on the Queets, and there is a harvest rate associated with some of those fisheries. So I guess, from the tribal side, how is that accounted for with the tribal guides? I think that's a missing piece, and especially a river like the Queets right now that is really kind of struggling, that shouldn't be struggling as bad. I guess we'd like to understand, how are those fish accounted for too? So just something that just popped in my head.
Yeah, I'll say catch accounting, and I can say this, with confidence. Catch accounting in Region 6, tribal co-managers in Region 6 is extremely good, and that includes sport fisheries. So there's guide fisheries with the Quinault tribe that you mentioned, Rich, and they operate creel programs. That's something, we don't do in those rivers and that they do. So we have summary information of their catch data, but we don't have any to provide them besides catch record card data and estimates from the past. So yeah, those are creel. The last 3 years, Tyler Jerison, their harvest manager, has really stepped up their creel program there. And so yeah, they monitor those specific fisheries. And then I know, but it's a great question, Rich. It's a really good question. And then just Greer's going to shoo us along here, and I think that's the right thing to do. I just wanted to flag, though, a couple of things I heard that we should circle back with the bigger team in future meetings and even over email. I heard multiple people talk about fewer encounters. So maybe folks sort of limiting their own catch. That's a regulation one. I think it'd be cool if people kept thinking about that. The one and done, I heard someone say. That's going to be a question mark in my notes. And then the other one is Bob and others talked about these concentrated efforts in certain times and places during the day or certain times of the year, December, January, and then concentrating the conservation effort around wild fish in certain times and places. So those are ones that aren't just quick and easy throw into the plan. So maybe we keep talking about those. So thanks, folks. Okay, Greer, I'll stop talking.
Okay, thank you. All right, and like I said, continue to add to this live document. It's really just intended as a place to capture your thoughts and comments. So thank you, everybody. Sorry to move you along. This is great discussion, and I think we're all appreciating being able to talk about some of these things, but we do need to move on. Toby, I'm assuming you're gonna steal the screen back, and Anja, I think you're gonna maybe have a presentation or some slides. So I'll hand it off to you. And we have about a half hour for presentation and discussion. So you may have to move fairly quickly through your slides. Jonathan, did you have a question?
Yeah, I actually wanted to do a quick check-in regarding the timeline for tonight. We're pretty far over schedule, right?
Yes, this time was cut in about half. So we have to have 15 minutes for public comment. So we have about a half hour for this. So we may not get through it all.
So, yeah, I mean, can we trim some of the public comment down? Do we really need 15 minutes for that? I mean, we have a public portal where people can submit those comments, and the way that we're running over time right now, I feel like cutting the hatchery discussion by 30 minutes isn't really doing anyone any favors.
Yeah, I'll say as a facilitator, we haven't used 15 minutes in the past. We haven't needed that for public comment. And we've also gone over about 5 minutes to accommodate that. So I'm saying 30 minutes, knowing that probably we're gonna take more like 40 or 45. So let's shoot for 30. And I'm thinking that we're probably gonna take more than that, if that's okay with you. But agreed, and we may have to follow up with some of these some of this discussion at our next meeting, which I think is already part of the plan, if I'm right. Is that right, Toby, is to continue some of the hatchery discussion at the next meeting?
Yes, it is. Thanks, Greer. Yeah, so my goal for this meeting, just kind of going into it, one thing that I was really hoping that we would get a lot of feedback on fisheries regulations. And this has been awesome. So I'm really glad that we took all that time to really hear from people a little bit more in depth. And then for this hatchery section, we want to start the conversation, but keep in mind that at the next meeting, we're planning to have another chance to really dig in and have more discussion around it, kind of like we did today for the regulation piece. So we'll spend as much time as we can on it now, but we'll anticipate having more time for discussion in the next meeting. So I just wanted to queue up this topic a little bit before Anja jumps in. So Anja has been working from a scientific perspective, doing this evaluation of hatchery production, and in terms of how we're approaching this coastal steelhead proviso implementation plan, we're taking some of the work that she has done and kind of trying to apply it to these management strategies that we're developing. And so our goal in utilizing some of this information in the coastal steelhead proviso implementation plan is to try to meet pre-existing statewide steelhead management plan genetic influence thresholds. So there are numbers established in the statewide steelhead management plan, thresholds for genetic influence. And so we want to use our best available science that we have, basically the work that Anja and others, Gary Marston has done, to try to make sure that we're meeting those pre-existing management objectives with hatcheries. And so this means that in some cases we may increase or decrease releases depending on wild steelhead run size and also the availability of fishery or hatchery tools. So basically we're trying to figure out how many fish we can release to still stay within these pre-existing management thresholds. And there are some places where there are significant tweaks, like increasing trapping efficiency, for instance, that could have pretty significant impacts on the numbers of smolts that we can release in certain systems. And so that's something that we want to explore and think about, and make sure that we're considering all the nuances of as we move forward with this process, and thinking about what kind of tools we can implement here. And we want to make sure that we're managing proactively to optimize the utilization around hatchery releases. So basically what we mean there is that we want to make sure that hatchery fish, as much as possible, are ending up in places where we can catch them, where we have open fisheries. Bob, as you pointed out, you know, and others have pointed out, we've had a big issue with hatchery fish coming back, potentially straying to spawning grounds in areas where there's closed fisheries. So we really want to think about how we can make sure that we're not wasting resources, and make sure that we're able to plan ahead for hatcheries and the way that we release fish, so that we're optimizing the number of hatchery fish that we can catch. And so we'll talk more about that, and I'm curious to hear kind of your ideas on that as we move through this process. But that's kind of the thinking pattern that we've been using going into this. And so just wanted to set that up a little bit. And James, is there anything you want to add there?
No.
Okay, so I will hand it over to Anya, and I have some slides for Anya. So Anya, just let me know when you're ready to move on to the next slide.
Okay, can everyone hear me okay? All right. You never know with computers, it's like, I don't feel like working today. So as I said earlier, hi, I'm Anya Huff. I am a co-author of the crazy modeling that I'm gonna walk you guys through today. So we were, so you can, next. So we were, Gary Marston and I were tasked with looking at coastal steelhead programs, and kind of how they're doing measured up against the adopted statewide steelhead management plan by the state. Like Toby said earlier, it has pretty set goals of kind of where it thinks, you know, where the policy, where it thinks that the threshold should be for both gene flow and PHOS, P&I goals for both segregated and integrated programs. Segregated programs are not to exceed 2% gene flow, and for integrated programs, the thresholds were 30% PHOS, so proportion of hatchery origin spawners, and the percentage of hatchery origin spawners, or a PNI of 0.7, which is proportion of natural influence. So since the inception of the SSMP, there hasn't really been any evaluation or intense modeling of these coastal programs to, you know, really take a deep dive of how they do stand up against, you know, how they're doing, basically. So we looked at basically the entire coast of Washington and all the steelhead programs, which was pretty big task. So we utilized two specific models. For integrated programs, we used the all-H analyzer model, which was mainly what I ran. And then the segregated programs were modeled using the demographic gene flow model, which was created by Annette Hoffman and run by Gary Marston. Next. So I'll go over the one that's a little bit kind of more straightforward and a little less in-depth, and that is not in-depth, but a little more straightforward, not a lot of behind the scenes calculations. So that's the all-H analyzer, and that's the one I utilize most. It uses the hatchery and natural populations, and it looks at what your escape, you know, looks at your escapements, looks at, okay, what your program size is, you know, how much natural population are you using for brood, so your natural origin brood percentages, and basically it kind of pushes up that, you know, okay, if you have if your hatchery is surviving at this level, if you got this many recruits per spawners, if you have this much harvest rate on both your natural and your hatchery origin fish, how many fish are you expected to get back in the natural origin brood? Basically, how many fish back to the river? How much harvest are you going to have? What's your natural influence, and then what's your PHOS rate? And you can basically, once you get everything in there, you can kind of scale your programs to fit the size that you need to see in order to meet these thresholds. And we inputted data from our own database that we collect data for and basically utilize. And so that was your survival, your harvest rate, and your trapping efficiency. But we utilized tribal net harvest, CRC data, amongst other things. Next. And so this is a big slide. So this is basically all the inputs to kind of show you kind of what we really put into this model. I say it's straightforward and easy, but it's a lot of data. So all these numbers are based off of data that we collected from the region, as well as ones that we had in-house in the hatchery evaluation unit. And we were asked by science division, okay, so you have this model. Well, what's your, what's your confidence level in the data that you have? And like I said, all this data is based off of general numbers, papers, that kind of thing. Anything in the green, we are really confident in. These were either directly calculated from the model, or they were influenced. They were calculated from data from the hatcheries, from the regions. We're pretty confident in these ones. The ones in the yellow, we're a little less confident. We'd like some more data for those particular ones. We think a little more data wouldn't hurt, especially like habitat production levels, because it shifts a lot. So we'd really like to have some more, data on that. The stuff in the red, the data in the red is a little less confident. We're not 100% on it. We're still confident in it, but it's not like we take it to the bank. So the SAR for observed, which is kind of a big one, it's the natural origin survival. It's generally assumed that it's about 1/3 to 1/4, roughly above hatchery survival. So generally on the coast, hatchery survival is in the 3% range. So we assumed, based on Snow Creek, wild Chehalis stocks, and kind of looking at other, kind of surrogates, that a 4% range SAR for wild fish along the coast would be reasonable. But we'd like to have some more data on that one. And so those are just kind of the inputs that we put into that particular model. It doesn't have any fun graphs that it spits out for anything, but like the demographic gene flow model does. So the demographic gene flow model is a pretty big model. It uses basically red count data across the board, both hatchery origin and natural origin, to determine the crossover temporally, and looks at, okay, if you have this temporal overlap, what is the potential gene flow between hatchery origin fish and natural origin fish in this time frame? And so we used, we used hatchery releases and escapement that we had, and we also looked at hatchery spawning ground red surveys, and we put all of that into the DGM, and it kind of helped show kind of the natural breaks when you might have influence over between hatchery origin spawners and natural origin spawners. Next. There's more. So the hatchery spawning data and the trap dates that we received from the regions kind of help determine a mean spawn date, and kind of when a good break or delineation between natural origin spawners and hatchery spawners would occur. The models then, they have a pretty high sensitivity to the trapping efficiency within the model, and kind of, okay, how efficient is your trap? How much, how many fish are you taking off? Because that can, determine and the removal of hatchery fish. And we are actually lacking pretty solid trapping efficiency data. So we'd like to see that kind of be improved across the board. We used 6-year averages for both escapement and for wilds and hatchery fish, as well as for trapping efficiency for that. So next. I know this is a lot to take in, deep breaths. Okay, so this is what gets put into and calculated by the demographic gene flow model. And this is for Willapa Bay rivers, so North Willapa River and Nacelle. And basically this is looking at, the proportion of natural origin spawners, the proportion of hatchery origin spawners, your fitness levels, your proportion of natural origin spawners that are actually hatchery origin. And we did basically the same confidence level parameters. These parameters were given to, we got from the Spawning Ground Survey database, the escapement database. We used the Iraqi et al. Paper to look at fitness. And then we also calculated and used 6-year averages for the K1 and 2, which is fitness. We also used it for homing, strays, and then the proportion of natural origin spawners that are hatchery, which is the Q at the bottom, and then for natural origin spawners. And it just kind of, like I said, it's a lot to take in. But all of this gets fed into it, and it will basically create an awesome little graph that is the next slide, and it gives us kind of our overlap. So this is the Willapa Bay, Willapa River. And so you have your hatchery origin spawners, your natural origin spawners, and then the purple is basically the overlap of the hatchery origin spawners and the natural origin spawners. And that gives the model some that gives the model basically where our overlap is, and it calculates your potential gene flow from there. And this is just kind of a nice visual representation of what the calculations give us. That should be next. Yeah, next. Okay. So this is the mean spawn dates and associated standard deviations for the natural winter populations and the segregated hatchery programs that we ran. So the mean spawning day number, the thing to think of that for that one is that December 1st is what we consider day one. So you have things like bogus shield where you have a -15. Well, that means it was 15 days prior to December 1. So it's a little bit earlier. And then, so the cutoff day, the natural hatchery cutoff day. So the date is actually, of course, is corresponding to the mean number of days minus the 3 standard deviations for the natural origins and plus 3 standard deviations for the hatchery origins. So there's concern over, March 15th cutoff date. It's not really cutoff date. It's more like a delineation date. Like, okay, this is a natural break. And so what the model does is it goes in and says, okay, we've got this kind of this delineation between this good break between hatchery origin and natural origin fish. And it basically looks at at all the red data, it looks at the standard deviation, it looks at your date, at your numbers and your mean spawn days, and it creates tails so that it fills in where you may think you're missing fish, but it actually calculates out tails so that you're getting the best available data crossover of where that overlap is, so that you calculate a gene flow that isn't looking at worst case scenario, which is across the entire span, because without that delineation, you're just looking at thinking, okay, everything's going to basically cross over the entire way. And that's actually the worst case scenario where you're looking at all of the gene flow. With a delineation day, basically, you're looking at, okay, we know that there's definitely going to be some hatchery fish after this day, and there's definitely going to be hatchery or natural origin fish before this day. And so let's calculate a standard deviation to look at a tail, say, okay, we know that there's gonna be some this way. We know there's gonna be some this way. Let's look at over what the potential gene flow is for those. So it's kind of the best available days to look at and to create those tails for that gene flow. And so we know that we need some more research and looks at kind of, okay, this is the natural cutoff day that we're seeing in the red data, but we'd definitely like to see some more research and some more looks at kind of, okay, across the board, is this really what we need to use? Do we need to use something different? But right now it's looking pretty good. So I know that was a lot to take in. The models are pretty hefty, but that was my last slide, I believe, other than acknowledging all the people I bugged. So definitely Gary Marston, Toby Harrison for just, helping and modeling and all that stuff, because Gary is definitely the DGM master. And of course, all the Region 6 staff that I bugged with emails, phone calls, Teams meetings, Teams calls for all of the data that they provided for us. Red count data, harvest rates, just the menagerie of requirements for these very large models that we ran. With that, I will probably be taking a lot of questions.
Thank you, Anya. Toby and James, do you want to add anything before we head to questions and maybe teeing up what discussion topics might come out of this initial discussion of hatcheries?
I've got nothing to add. No, thanks,
Okay.
Anya. Good job.
Anything, Toby, to add?
I have a few more ideas I want to share, but I'd like to hear from the advisors first.
Yep, go ahead, Bob.
So Anya, when you're looking at that stuff and some of the science that you're using, how much of that is recent science, like just developed in the last few years, or is this developed, years ago? And how
Like the
current-
models we were using, or
Yeah, the models you're using now.
So the models we're using now have kind of gone through several metamorphoses. They were developed I'd say the AHA was probably what version that I got a hold of was around like 2016, 17, but it's gone through another 2 or 3 styles basically. And the one we use is the most recent, the most up to date. And is only 2 years old. So we started really utilizing it into 2020. Yeah, gotta remember what year it is. And then the DGM is also pretty new, but it's also gone through it's gone through a little bit more robust changes. We've kind of updated it within the group, within heat unit to kind of be a little bit more, not so much robust, but just kind of more what we need it to do and show us. But the DGM itself is about 5 years old. So it's all relatively new in the realm of science.
Yeah, because so some of the information that I looked at when you're looking at that, I mean, if we go back in time, and the whole idea, like we use March 15th as kind of that kind of medium line that we use in a lot of places. And looking at those lines, there used to be times like, let's say I like the bogus shield, take that for instance. They used to plant fish, hatchery fish, way up above the bridge a long time ago. So those fish would go up there and they would stray around and they would hang out, and probably most of them spawned in the wild because there was no trap. There was no trap for those fish to go to. So they would stay out there. They used to plant, same thing in the Hoh River. They used to plant fish at Willoughby Creek on the Hoh for years. And so those fish then would be out there. So we knew that there were hatchery fish hanging around in the wild and possibly spawning up there. Since then, though, we've got rid of those programs and they're no longer there. Same thing with the soul duck. We used to plant fish in the soul duck from the bogus shield. We don't do that anymore. There again, no trap. But what I am curious is, have we made adjustments for those deals, right? So I fish like the bogus shield and or the Hoh a lot. And not just myself, but a lot of the guides do. And I could tell you how many fish I catch, like how many stray hatchery fish I would catch above the bogus shield hatchery. and how many of those fish would be caught by not just me, but a lot of other anglers, and what the minimal number is. And so then we see reds up there, you know, in February, and we question them, and the comment's always been, well, we really don't know if those are wild or hatchery, you know, and so we don't take into account for that. So, you know, a lot of us question, like, well, hold on, you know, we're not catching hatchery fish up there. We're not catching spawned out hatchery fish that time of frame in those regions. The only ones we catch are right around the hatchery themselves. So how much of that is taken into consideration in those systems where, you know, particularly on the, like the bogus show, where you have a segregated program that's an early timed program, like the hump tulips is an early timed program, and typically you're not seeing a lot of fish after a certain time frame in January, and the stray rate, according to what we're seeing, is very, very low. So how do you answer that?
Hey, Bob, I'm going to jump in. Anya, just, I had trouble following what your question was there. And maybe Anya, if you got a solid answer for that, but I'm not sure what the question was.
So the models themselves, we get red count data, and it's, you know, sometimes unless you really see fish directly on the reds, it's kind of hard to determine, you know, definitively hatchery origin versus natural origin. We generally know just by looking at when the natural origin fish return in the hatchery escapement, you know, kind of you know, be able to determine whether or not that's a natural origin or a hatchery origin red. The model does take into account that there's going to be, you know, some on either side. And so to the best of my knowledge, and you know, it takes into account that you're going to have a little bit on either side, but the model itself is doesn't look at spatial overlap. It looks at temporal overlap. It looks at timing and the potential gene flow. So it doesn't necessarily take into account location within the river basin. I hope that answers the question.
Okay. Yep. That's good. Thanks.
Okay.
Thank you, Bob. Thank you, Anya. Go ahead, Jonathan.
Yeah, thank you, Anya. Thank you so much for the presentation. Thanks for coming to sit with us after hours, and obviously all the work that you know, you and Gary put into this. So it's already been modeled, right? And you know, there's very specific kind of objectives and metrics around hatchery production within the SSMP. So it's really, I'm hopeful and pleased to see, like, you know, the department taking these necessary steps. But I think kind of the, you know, with all these coastal programs, and now that the work's been done here, you know, I feel like the $1 million question is, are we meeting those objectives within the SSMP, and how far off are we with our coastal programs? I mean, I know that's a big question, but I'd be curious to see if you can get any insights into that for the group tonight.
So currently the results section of this particular scenario are currently within policy review, and I'm sure James can take over. But until I get the okay and that everything's copacetic, where it's just currently under review. So I'm sure James would like to weigh in and on that part of that question.
Yeah, so tonight the goal here was to describe this concept, right? That we have guidelines in the statewide steelhead management plan. The agency's extremely interested in meeting those guidelines. And so that's a big part of the work here with the proviso implementation work. So the first step here is just explaining that we have models to estimate gene flow and PHOS. And I think Anya did a great job of that. Anya and others worked on a white paper that formally analyzes each one of these stocks using the methods that were just described. And that's the piece we all want to see, right? The results, because that's what we're going to apply to our work here. So the agency, anytime we publish something, has a formal technical review and policy review process. So it's moving through that process now. This work that Anya is talking about, we've applied in other areas of the state, and you can imagine it has pretty big policy implications. So the idea that it's going to take a while to get through policy review and make sure we communicate to the director and the commission and everyone involved what this may mean is pretty important. So I think we're on the right path here as long as folks understand the concept. And that's probably what I think we should field questions on. So, but before we do, you know, I'm going to pause just for a second because I want to be just really upfront. There's a few major things that drive the results of what Anya talked about. And I want to make sure folks track that. It's trapping efficiency, it's stray rates, and wild steelhead abundance is a really big one. So when the number of wild steelhead decline, you can imagine PHOS and gene flow rates will go up. And so if we've got really healthy populations of wild steelhead, this probably isn't a topic we even really need to discuss because we're likely meeting expectations in the statewide steelhead management plan. So I heard Rich talk about earlier that there's certain things in there that we're not doing. Part of that is just a product of declining steelhead abundance. So the first step is make sure we dust off these models, make sure we know how to use them, make sure technical and policy review has gone through what it needs to. And then the next steps to apply it to this work. So hope that answers it.
Yeah. Hey, James, I got one more. I got a follow-up question then
Cool.
for you. And this is kind of more along the process here. Will we see these kind of recommendations at the next meeting then, and kind of, you know, following along that as advisors, what kind of level of input will we have as advisors to the recommendations?
Yeah, so I hope we see those as soon as possible. I'm not on the policy review panel. I helped with the technical review of this document, so I've provided my 2 cents, and I think helped shape it. So that's pretty cool. But the next step is to make sure everybody at Fish and Wildlife is comfortable with the work that's been done here. So I can't tell you when it's going to be done, Jonathan. Sorry. But I will say the coastal steelhead proviso implementation is due in December, right? We know that. So the clock's ticking, and this is a big piece of the puzzle is, to be consistent with the statewide steelhead management plan. These are guidelines we're interested in meeting.
Thank you for that, James. More to come, it sounds like. Go ahead, Roy.
Oh, I just see they changed the picture. I was going to ask who took that other picture or who was holding that fish out of the water. But
It was Gary Marston's picture.
yeah, no, that's picking on stuff differently than I intend to. I appreciate James's remarks, and I really bore down studying that statewide management steelhead plan. And correct me, people that are finer readers and better scientists than I, but I got a gut-wrenching feeling that as I read that about hatchery and genetic flow and wild stocks, that they sort of loosened the nuts and bolts on protection for wild steelhead gene flow by some of the insinuated propping up declining wild stock runs with more hatchery, which it just seems, did I read that incorrectly or not? I found, I'm grateful for our work, and I'm grateful for all of this agency team working together so closely with the advisors that kind of came out, hey, we're here, talk to us, and you are. But the articulation with the proviso for the coast and then driving it out of the steelhead management plan, I have questions about the security of wild steelhead stock inventories with the hatchery programs. And so anyone that in subsequent conversations that can elaborate that or help me understand better, I'd appreciate it, or a sidebar conversation too. But I just worry about that. I live on the Hoko, and I caught the brood stock for the Macaw Hoko hatchery, and I've closely monitored that, and have lived with our fly fishing only rigs above the Hoko High Bridge with a kill on hatchery fish above there, even into March 15th. And I have tracked that, and there, in my experience, there's a little more straying because it's a smaller river and I'm on top of it. I float the hoe and do red surveys with Fish and Wildlife Agency staff as a volunteer. I do a lot of foot traffic here on the Hoko and Little Hoko, and I do see clipped fish in waters beyond the hatchery, a little more than bob animated on the bogey there.
Hey, if I could just jump in here, I just want to make sure this concept, Roy, you're bringing up a good point, concern for wild fish. There's also folks probably listening and hopefully on this advisor group with different perspectives that are maybe worried about their hatchery populations and what these results might mean for their programs. So I want to remind folks that this tool that Anya just provided us allows us to identify places where we may be releasing more fish than the statewide steelhead management plan suggests we should. But there's going to be places that, you know, we find in the results, is my guess, where there's room to release additional fish. This tool also is going to be really handy when people come to the state. We've used it in the past, like the Snyder Creek program, when people say we'd rather have an integrated program than a segregated program, or we want to change a segregated to an integrated. And this is the tool we would use to sort of lay out that menu of options. So I just want to let folks know you could come at this tool with a lot of different perspectives.
Yes.
So yeah, thanks for that. Thanks for letting me share that.
Well, it comforts me to know your thoughtful, broader perspective on that, James. I know that you're looking at a lot more sides of it than I'm aware of, so I appreciate that.
Thank you, everybody.
Roy, I just wanted to jump in quickly here, and we are going to talk more about this in the next meeting. But just briefly, you know, one thing that's on our minds is how we're going to fit this work into that adaptive management strategy within the coastal steelhead proviso implementation plan. So we'll talk more about that next time. We want to make sure that we're meeting up our objectives, even if we have closed fisheries. And so, yeah, that's something we want to circle back on. And also, Roy, I wanted to respond in a little bit about the language in the statewide steelhead management plan. There's language in there about conservation hatchery programs. And that is an area of, you know, ongoing and active research. And I think some of the language in there reflects work that's been done on conservation hatchery programs in other areas, but not on the coast. So that's something we should talk more about as well.
I appreciate that perspective. I've been part of the Lake Ozette sockeye thing since '86. And we have mitigation hatchery programs with that on Umbrella Creek, and, you know, just to prop up survival of the gene pool as it is, you know.
Yeah, so sort of on that note, I know we're pretty close to running out of time here, but I also wanted to just flag that something that we're considering and thinking about and assessing is this idea of wild gene banks or wild steelhead management zones. And this is something that's called for in the statewide steelhead management plan as well. And there are set criteria for what populations and streams should look like to be considered as wild steelhead management zones. And so that is a larger stakeholder and co-manager process to determine where those are located. But we are looking at that and thinking about it and doing that assessment actively. And there is one wild steelhead management zone on the coast so far on the Solduck River. Here's this lovely picture of Solduck Falls. And thinking ahead to next week, or not next week, next meeting, our next steps, the homework assignment is going to be to read the artificial production section of the statewide steelhead management plan and come to the next meeting prepared to discuss that. So Roy, you kind of queued that up nicely. And then optional assignments also are to review drafts and send feedback no later than 2 weeks prior to the next meeting. So kind of like what we did this last time. And I'll send a draft back with tracked changes. And then also feel free to reach out and share more ideas and feedback about the test fishery or really anything else that we talked about tonight. And our next meetings will be in August, September, and November. So.
Thank you. You did my job, Toby, which is great because we're out of time. Any final thoughts or questions? Go ahead, Jonathan.
Yeah, so Toby, with regards to the response matrix, comment response matrix that Greer sent out 6 days ago. Is there going to be any time for us as a group to kind of talk about that some more? If there's some pieces where, you know, maybe we don't feel like we're getting enough clarification, or we'd like to continue to the discussion, are we going to have an opportunity to do that? Or is that kind of, that's the response matrix, that's done, we're moving on?
Yeah, so on the response matrix, you know, I didn't respond to every individual comment because there were hundreds of individual comments. So what I tried to do was respond to comments that captured things that multiple people had said, or things that I thought would be good ideas to share with the whole group. But if there are things that you want to talk more about that you think we missed there, feel free to reach out, send us an email, or ask to have it included on the agenda for the next meeting. So really it's just intended as a communication tool, but it's not like this is my final word and I'm not saying anything else. Feel free to reach out if you want to have more discussion about that, or if you want to add it as an agenda item in a future meeting.
Okay, that sounds good. Thank you.
Yeah, good point, Toby. Thanks for mentioning that, Jonathan. So we have the response to comment matrix, we have the track change version, we have all your comments. We also have public comments, and I did forget to note that there's a new version of export from the public portal that's now available to advisory group members within that public comment folder, which will be linked in your summary as well. But it's all on your SharePoint folder. If you're having trouble finding anything, or if you have specific questions, or like Jonathan alluded to, would like a specific topic added to your next agenda, please just reach out. Hopefully we'll start to get in the groove for the last 3 meetings of how this process will look. But we really do appreciate your feedback on what you'd like to discuss, and what information you need.
Hey, Greer, one last thing on that. Go back to that last slide. I know that the syllabus is updated for the August and September meeting. I don't think it has been for November meeting in terms of kind of, you know, our draft agenda. Can we make that as an action item coming out of this meeting, just so we kind of know where we're headed with that?
Toby, is that possible, or are you trying to be more open for that agenda for the November meeting? What's your thought on that?
No, in fact, I was planning to update it today, but I was having some issues with SharePoint being able to access it. So we'll do that, you know, within the next few days.
Great. So we'll mark that as an action item, and we'll send that out. Maybe we can send it with the other materials that are going to go out with the meeting. So sure thing, Jonathan. We got that down.
Thank you.
Okay, so apologies to the public participants. We had a lot to get through, even though we extended the time, but I think we had some good discussion. So we're going to shift to the public comment period of our meeting. If you can go to the next slide, Toby, I think there was perfect public comment. And then Olivia, I think there's potentially something you need to do on your end, but we're going to allow for public comment. Again, if you have a public comment, please raise your hand and we'll allow you to talk through the Zoom interface. So thanks to all those that stayed on late into the night. And I want to make sure they can, Olivia, is there something we need to do?
I am now opening the chat for public comment to everybody, and then you can also raise your hand and we can promote you to speak.
Go ahead, Guy Fleischer. Oh, let's see.
On mute. There. Now
There
I'm
we go.
muted. Yeah,
We can hear you.
So I want to thank the advisory group. You guys taking a lot of work. This is great to see. And I actually sat through this whole meeting, and you guys do this a lot, so I'm impressed. I think one thing, I think Jonathan brought it up, and I saw Rich spoke to it, was the resident trout issue. And I think it's really important that resident micas are important contributors to a project that eventually become anadromous. And that's kind of a fact we ignore. And I couldn't find any reference to resident trout in the management plan. And maybe James or someone can help me on that. But to me, we're fixated on the spawning runs, but we kind of forget about these fish. And we know that they've been anywhere from 1 to 4 years in the fresh water. And it's a really important part of their life history. And I think we need to spend more time thinking about that. And now if we're going to be doing gene banks, we need to also involve protection of those animals in their freshwater state. That's my 2 cents. Thanks.
Thank you, Guy. Excellent comment.
Hey, Greer, I'll just say real quickly, the Steelhead at Risk report and some of the other sort of key documents we use to understand steelhead on the coast highlight these resident rainbow trout as an important component of the life history. And then recently there's been a couple studies that have come out of our shop, Fish and Wildlife, demonstrating that these resident rainbows produce anadromous smolt. So I'm just nodding my head, everything you're saying. I want to highlight for everyone listening, the last 3 years on the coast, you have not been allowed to harvest resident rainbow trout at all, but these were emergency rules. So these aren't permanent rules. So just want to make sure we're all on the same page. So thanks for your comment there.
Thank you, James. Any other public comments tonight? And again, thank you, Olivia, for the reminder. You're welcome to type in the chat box or raise your hand and we can call on you.
Greer, this is Roy, can we remind the people waiting on deck, if there are any, they can give written information? I enjoyed looking through all those comments from the people that typed them in last time.
Yes, excellent point, Roy. That was actually where I was going to head next, is if there aren't any comments, public comments, either in the chat or through raising hands and verbal comments, what we can do is paste in the chat, and hopefully, I think, Olivia, they have access to that, the link to the public portal. And then anyone on the meeting who's from the public, you're welcome to use the public portal and type your comments in there. And as I said earlier, what we're doing is compiling those on a regular basis and uploading them to the SharePoint site for the advisory group so they can review them prior to their next meeting. So they will have those available to them, and it sounds like they're reviewing them. So appreciate that. Thank you, Aaron, for putting that in there. And reach out to any of the DFW staff if you have problems or questions about how to access that public portal. But I'm going to take one more moment just in case. And Rich, did you say, can we make them permanent? Did you want to make their comments permanent? Just want to clarify.
No, I'm sorry. It was just kind of more of when we were talking about, James talked about that the regulations for resident rainbow trout had just been temporary over, for lack of a better word, for the last couple of years and everything, and thinking more in terms, can we make that more of a permanent regulation, and especially when they're vulnerable a lot more in the summer and everything, and how do we regulate that from a gear standpoint as well to reduce mortalities.
Thanks, Rich. And Chris, did you have a quick question or comment? Saw you raise your hand, but.
Yeah, it was just, you put up the live notes that you said we could potentially go on. When I went in to log onto it, it said that my access was denied.
Gotta love SharePoint. Okay, let's reach out tomorrow. We will troubleshoot any issues that advisory group members are having with that. That actually is in your meeting folder, Chris.
Okay.
Just to clarify, so the meeting folder for this June meeting includes like the summary, the materials, the agenda. It also has a link to those live notes. So that's another way to access it. And if you can get into the SharePoint site, you should be able to get into that, but we can troubleshoot.
Okay.
Thank you. And then Greg, one more public comment before we sign off. Greg is, I don't know if you want to speak to this, but I'll just read it off. Wondering if in the regimes for season setting, Will previous year's returns be a factor in regulation setting? For example, if a system missed escapement previously, but forecasts look good now, does that weigh in on the path forward? Any response to that, James?
Yeah, so we don't know yet. This is going to be a really big topic of discussion. It's a really, I think, a smart question. I just want to flag if we have these three regimes, one is we're in the red, right? Conservation, one's intermediate, and one is we're doing really well. If we're in the intermediate stage, we want to create tools that push us into the positive. We don't want to get stuck in this phase we've been in, right? Where we can have fisheries, but we're barely meeting escapement or not meeting it. So we're exploring tools. We want to make sure you guys have something to talk about. So we're putting together tools that would maybe look at what's our track record over the last 3 or 4 years and how will that affect fisheries moving forward. Not sure how that's going to look. That's kind of right where our brains are at now. So it's like you saw the future there. So thanks for that.
Thanks. Go ahead, Jonathan.
Yeah, hey, this is if we need to wrap it up, that's fine, but this gets back to a question I had about the comment matrix, Toby, and I was wondering with regards to a comment that I think was pretty came from a few different people regarding the management regime. And I know some people had said, well, why don't we add a fourth column and let's talk about it in that context. You know, you brought up or you made the point that the columns that we have now in the current management regime in this plan are following along with the pre-existing management objectives that are established in the SSMP. Can you clarify exactly where that is in the SSMP? And I'm sorry if I've missed that or seen where that was discussed, but for the life of me, I could not find that.
Sure. So in the SSMP, it states that we can have impacts on fish returning above escapement, right? So
yeah, totally.
Yeah. And then if we're not meeting escapement, then we can impact 10% of the run, right? That's in there. And then we also have the ability to close fisheries if we don't think we're going to meet those management objectives. So that's what those 3 columns are.
Okay, I got you. So is this pulled from there's that kind of matrix, that management abundance matrix on one of the pages in there. I think it's on natural production. Or is this in somewhere else? So maybe you can point to me offline where that is.
Sure. Yeah, I'd be happy to. I don't know, what page it's on, but we can talk about that.
Great. Thanks for the question, Jonathan.
Yeah, thanks for taking that.
Yeah, and I think Toby said a couple times, if you have any questions like that, I feel like she's more than willing to talk with you one-on-one. She's great at doing that via email. I've seen it go back and forth. So definitely reach out to Toby or James or Aaron if you have any questions, or us if you have any process-related questions. And with that, just stay tuned for some materials coming out to follow up to this meeting. We'll also be scheduling our next August meeting. We have a better scheduling process to hopefully accommodate all the different scheduling challenges that summer comes with. So we'll be scheduling our August meeting sometime in July, and stay tuned for more materials via email. But thank you all for staying late, and have a great rest of your night.
Hey, I just want to say thanks everybody for hanging out with us so long.
Yeah.
We really appreciate it.
Yeah,
Thank
thank
you.
you.
Yes, thanks, everybody.
See you next time.
Yep. Have a good night.
Good night. You.